A blond man stood over an army of corpses, his coat blowing in the wind as he stood tall and firm. He looked into the horizon, unbothered by the pile of discarded bodies behind him, and he stood there pondering. A man approached, and he called his name. The attendant's name was Ash, and the blonde mentioned that he had the man leading the Eastern Subjugation Force, so he asked why his attendant had come now. The other man, bleeding and holding his arm, mumbled that he had come to strike him down. The blonde did not seem to take Ken aback, though his eyes did blaze a glowing red. The attendant went on, saying that his master had planned to use his troops as bait from the very beginning. The blonde had only wanted to throw them away so that he could win this war. He grabbed his sword tightly and called out to the man who was his father. The blonde was unapologetic, and his icy gaze showed no regret. He questioned the good of keeping the wingless around, and he asked his foolish son if he agreed. Naturally, the boy did not consider that he had come all this way to kill his father. Ashe Elmheim. The Elmheims, the continent's greatest martial house, had pledged their swords to the royal family as guardian. Its head was Roderick A. Elmheim, who was the icy dark blonde who stood before him now. The Mad Lord was the sole possessor of them in this nation. On some whim, the Dark Lord had rescued the boy from a blizzard where he lay dying. He had saved the boy's life, taking the babe from its dead mother. So to repay that debt, the boy had done everything that he was asked, and he fought long and hard every day to repay the kindness of the father who raised him. However, the boy's life had not been easy. He recalled days of lying face, first in the dirt, his furniture shattered beneath him, and other noble boys laughing at him. They would call him wingless, for he was not born into a noble house, and mock him for having no crest. The boy had no wings to repay his father with. The wings, it seemed, were more than just the crest of a noble house flag. It was also a crest that held magical power, and the more wings you had, the greater your ability. His siblings had called him the only one in the Duke's house who could not use magic, the wingless child. Even so, the boy never gave up or stopped fighting for what he wanted. He took his sword up relentlessly, and he trained every day in difficult exercises. He did push-ups, sword jabs, and ran long distances for many miles, all to bulk up his speed and endurance. The boy believed that one day his devotion would surely be rewarded by the father whom he loved so much. However, that day at the war front, when the dark-haired man had scouted out the area in preparation to attack, he had wondered why, in that snowstorm so fierce, why was his army being ambushed in a spot like this? All this time, the boy had strongly believed in his father, and he had followed him dutifully. The boy asked the father if this was his answer, and his blonde paternal jerk asked what else shall the tool expect from him. The boy's purpose was served, a disposable tool, and now he could leave their house. After everything he had sacrificed, he was to be discarded like that. Naturally, the kid did not take kindly to it, and he flew forward with his sword raised. He had trusted his father so much just to get let down like this. With anger in his eyes, the boy flew at his father, cursing what a fool he had been as he swung his sword in that cold, snowy land. The blond man smiled the entire time that his adopted son attacked, his expression haughty, perhaps because his son had nicked his neck but had been unable to commit to taking his life. Before the dark-haired boy could fulfill his new pledge, his noble brothers appeared and tied him down with red chains, forcing the boy to the ground. Together they attacked with their swords and arrows, cutting his body and forcing him down. The poor boy screamed in pain, rage, and agony. The other brothers jeered, telling their adopted sibling that he truly did not understand. In the end, a wingless child was just a wingless child, and there was no saving a loser like him. Crawling on the ground like that suited him perfectly. The poor boy growled and curled his fingers into a bitter, bloody fist, asking why they had taken him in if they were just going to throw him away. The man just chuckled and told the young fool not to flatter himself. The blonde, cold man admitted that he never had any use for the boy from the start. The poor boy stared in disbelief and pain. What the blonde had truly wanted was the power of the 7 wings dwelling within the boy's body. The dark-haired boy stared in confusion, his cut arm bleeding out as he asked about the 7 wings. Apparently, this wicked man had known the boy's mother, and he called her quite useful. She had borne him the seed that he needed for the Dark Duke's sake. He then turned away and left the boy confused, stretching out his hand to him, desperate and in pain. He had no idea what the man was talking about. He begged for the Duke Roderick to give him an answer. However, the Duke gave no response, and he only showed the boy his back as his half-siblings came up behind him and raised their swords. After that was the deafening silence and an even more deafening pain. It was so cold after they left and the blood seeped from the dark-haired boy's body. His vision continued to fade, and he wondered if this was where he was going to die, in the snow, just like where he had started. He wondered what the point of everything that he had lived for was. As he lay on the floor, he could hear the distant ringing of church bells. Everything was pure white and faintly warm. The boy wondered if this was the afterlife. However, as he stared at the sky ahead, he noticed that his body was significantly smaller. The boy sneezed, exhausted in the snow, and that was when he realized that this vision was real. He was wrapped in a soft cloth and lying beside his mother's body. He had no idea where he was, but this tiny body was familiar, and he wiggled his foot to confirm it. This tiny heaven was also his, somehow. It was like an infant's body. Then he realized that he was, in fact, inside an infant's body. Right now, he was no more than a child, and there was a figure beside him. The boy in the snow turned and saw the cold face of his mother curled by his side. This woman, she seemed to be dead. Suddenly, he heard a voice calling for someone to search for her. They had to find that woman no matter what. She could not have gotten far in this blizzard. They had to find that woman for Duke Roderick's sake. They had to recover the infant that she took. Now the boy's eyes widened as he slowly started to realize what was going on and why those horsemen in the snow were racing desperately to find him. Just now, he had heard those horsemen call out the name Duke Roderick, the name of his terrible father who had left him to die in the snow. They were looking for the infant, and he was an infant right now. It did not take a genius to figure out what was going on. The boy recalled that he had been found on a blizzard night like this, too. He wondered, with his eyes wide, if he had somehow gone back to the past. That sounded ridiculous to him, but the sound of those hooves only resounded and got closer. It was a loud noise to an infant, and there was not a lot that he could do in a body that could barely move, so he decided to confirm it later. However, if he stayed with his mother, he would surely fall into the Duke's hands for sure. With a glowing hand, the little baby reached out in an attempt to escape, knowing that his priority right now should be getting as far away as possible. So the boy crawled forward, a hot gold hand touching the snow and pushing him forward. As he moved, the child cursed. It sucked to be stuck in such a tiny body, and he gasped because he could not breathe. His limbs were burning hot, and he could barely crawl forward anymore. However, the child was very determined to survive, and as he crawled, he swore that he would never forget the day that Roderick had turned his back on him. The baby, leaving a very obvious trail away from his mother's body, had not been able to get very far, of course. After all, he was just a child. However, he did come to a stop in front of someone a little different in this lifetime. A little girl found the baby, and she called her father's attention to the baby in the snow. The man who found him this time was the Viscount Highfried. The white-haired man stared curiously, wondering why there was an infant in a place like this. The man scooped up the baby, looking at the tired and exhausted child. Then he looked up, and it turned out that our little guy had been sincerely powered by a lot of magic because he had somehow crawled all the way out to a forest and down the hill all by his little strength. It was amazing. The Viscount would not believe the distance that this child had covered on his own, and he wondered just who this powerful, glowing baby was in his hands. The little baby wondered where he was now. He had desperately run as fast as his little baby legs had been able to carry him. There was a child in front of him for some reason, a baby with light red hair and big red eyes. The baby had come to take him, and he wondered if he was looking into the eyes of an angel. The boy's eyes snapped open, but it was an even worse situation than that. A child had grabbed his nose and was stopping him from breathing. Now that the little black-haired kid had woken up, the rest of the family quickly crowded around to stare at him. They called their big sister to tell her that the little one had woken up, and fortunately they snatched away the baby who was trying to suffocate him. There were a lot of children in this house. He counted about 5 just opening his eyes, and the big sister scolded them, telling them not to tease the baby, for his cute little nose might come off. The boy stared in shock to see each of them had grabbed a part of him for some reason, and were now tugging at him like he was some kind of toy. He had no idea what situation this was, but at least he was not in Roderick's house anymore. Still, this situation was confusing, and he wiggled out of the big sister's hands, leaping to the floor. Now that he was conscious, the boy had resumed his attempt to run, or in this case, quickly crawl away, cursing as he wondered what was happening to him. Before he got far, the kids called out to him and started to chase him. But that just made the desperate baby crawl faster. He had no idea why they were chasing him, but he wanted to hurry up and run away. With a burst of speed, his hand and eyes began to glow again, and magic filled his being. Suddenly, the baby, glowing a bright gold, burst right out of the roof of the house, shocked to see himself flying far above, because he had wanted to escape. This was magic. He had never been able to use magic in his past life, and he had no idea how he was using it now. The poor child could not control it, of course, and he wailed as he waved his arms around. He was flying now, but he had barely understood how he got up and did not know how to come down. He braced himself to make a very ugly and maybe even gory landing, but he was happily caught in the arms of the Viscount again, who was shocked to see the baby falling from the sky this time. He was such a peculiar child. The boy turned in surprise to find himself in the arms of the same man who had helped him last night, but this time he actually recognized him. This man was none other than the Duke Roderick's older brother, Viscount Highfried. The boy was shocked and wondered if the place where he had woken up could truly be the Viscount's home. Indeed, it seemed to be the other Elmheim house. The Highfried Elmheim, head of the Viscount house, a branch of Elmheim. He once stood as one of the twin wings alongside his younger brother Roderick, entrusted with protecting the royal family. However, Viscount Highfried had died in a civil war in the boy's past life, along with the collapse of the Viscount's house. Now, the young baby was certain that he had really fallen back to the past. However, he could not believe that he had worked to escape the Duke's house just to end up picked up by his brother instead. Bro really could not escape his destiny. Meanwhile, the sweet wife had picked him up now, and she rocked the baby in her arms. So it seemed this child's magic went out of control and he flew in the sky. The child was definitely not an ordinary baby. The woman smiled warmly at the baby, and she comforted him, saying that he must have been so scared, but it was all right now. The woman was warm and kind, and the little boy stared in awe at the sweet, angelic lady above him. The Duke's older brother also smiled, noting that the child harbors tremendous power. The mark on his back was proof of that, and he raised his shirt to show off the many wings etched into the boy's skin. The boy stared in absolute shock at the mirror-reflected image, something that he had never seen before. The boy had 7 wings, and he had no idea why it was on his body. Now, his eyes widened as he called the evil thing that Duke Roderick had told him in his past life. The Duke had said that he had just wanted the power of the 7 wings dwelling in the child's body. Now, the boy could understand what was going on. Back in the past, the Duke had picked up the helpless baby and had taken it like cargo under his arm. The man had picked up the baby from that blizzard just so that he could steal the wings right off his back, and he had called the baby wingless all his life. Naturally, the boy had every reason to be heated about the whole ordeal, but now he kind of understood why his half-siblings had laughed at him all his life. They had torn the wings from him, and then they mocked him for how hard he worked for the one who had ruined his life. Then, the sweet wife asked her husband what they would do with this child, and the baby paused in fear. This was the Duke's brother after all, and apples usually did not fall too far from the tree. He feared that he would suffer a similar fate and be taken advantage of by a different version of Roderick. It would be bad if this power were to fall into Elmheim's hands. After all, he needed this strength to get revenge on his former adopted father. The baby shook as he was already plotting his escape. He had to ditch as fast as he could. However, the Duke's older brother just said that he would take on his strange child as his adopted son. The baby stared at the man in surprise, but the man reached out and patted the head of the gentle child. This boy was merely a fledgling who could not even fly on his own just yet, until the day that he tried to take flight on his own. The white-haired man saw no reason that they should not look after this baby and care for him like he was their own. They would take responsibility for raising him, and the boy's eyes widened in awe at the father that he had always craved but had always been denied. The sweet moment did not last very long because the Viscount's 5 children came crashing through the door. The man sighed and asked his children if they had been eavesdropping on this very important discussion. The children admitted that they were worried about the baby. After all, it had suddenly shot through the air. There were lots of reasons to be worried. The man just smiled down at his children with a soft joy, watching as they crowded around his wife and the baby in her arms. The children happily asked the name of the child that their mother was holding, and the woman thought for a moment. They were going to keep him, so they should at least give him a name. In that case, they decided to name the boy Aster, the name of a new star born into their family. His former family had named him Ash, the name of dirt, but now the boy was reborn as a star. 10 years later, everything was going well and as planned, and many people were gathered at a luxurious estate. A carriage arrived and the Viscount Lord Highfried arrived, greeted by those who had been expecting his arrival. As the man arrived, a young boy pushed open the door and also stepped out of the carriage, surprising the attendant. It was, of course, an older version of Aster with a sword strapped to his hip. The boy smiled with joy and he stepped out, helping his sister Alfing out of the carriage as well. The baby that had once tried to suffocate him was now his beautiful sister, and she thanked her brother for helping her out of the carriage. Now the boy had grown strong and healthy, with a loving family and so many sisters. He walked forward with pride, following after his father and sister as they attended the sword dance gathering. This was a special annual event hosted by a certain duke's house under the Elmheim banner. It was a social gathering for noble warrior houses, and while it was a place for nobles to deepen their bonds, it was also a place for rivalry where each house would show off their young swordsmen who carried their family name. The Viscount walked out with his children, and he gained a lot of attention as he walked past. Everyone whispered as the man passed by, snickering that the Viscount's people had come to embarrass themselves again without learning their lesson. Instead of an heir who never comes, they adopted a boy of unknown origin. Right, the Viscount had a lot of daughters, so the sickening society did not see them as worthy heirs to his line and household. They wondered just how much more they would drag the Elmheim name through the mud. They all stared at the boy who had been adopted, calling him names behind his back. His sister sighed and told him not to let the whispers of the jobless rabble get to him. Here, those who showed weakness would obviously get crushed first. The brother noticed her hand was shaking. He had endured way worse from his own household when he had grown up under Duke Roderick, so this level of mockery was not new to him, but it seemed to be affecting his sister. The Viscount explained that this just happened to be their house's current position, and he wanted the children to see this for a reason. Then he asked his adopted son if he was disappointed that his adopted father was a joke among nobility. Honestly, the boy used to have a father who was such a big deal, and he had worked hard for that man just to be repaid by being killed in the snow. He had genuinely seen worse, so he just smiled and told his new dad that this kind of cold reception suited him just fine. His father laughed heartily, saying that the bold smile was rather reassuring after all. In Astor's past life, as the Elmheim's family's disgrace, he had the worst social debut imaginable. This place held bitter memories as he had been mocked, even as a member of Roderick's household. However, now that he had his wings back, the boy knew that he was different, and his power thrummed within his soul. His eyes shone with determination as he sat behind his sister and father, and he could see the faces of his former brothers through the window. Those jerks who had mocked him for all of his life. He could not wait for the opportunity to grind those monsters to dust. The boy's hands curled into a tight fist, and he readied himself as he stepped forward. Now, he planned to make a spectacular social debut. The battle started, and there were a bunch of people gathered around and cheering as they watched what was happening inside the ring. In an age when knights reigned supreme, knights were expected to possess both power and splendor. They would battle fiercely in the ring, and the people watching cheered for their favorite knight as they battled before them. Power through swordsmanship, splendor through fame, and the watching crowd that cheered for the victory of their own fighters. The two continued to fight back and forth, swinging their swords with determination to win and conquer. What demonstrated the most required skills between the two fighters was always the absolute family symbol, the wing crest. Using that amazing power, the white-haired fighter in the ring was able to activate and move even faster than his opponent, breaking their weapon and knocking them to the ground. The people cheered for the victorious fighter, and he raised his sword in victory and showed off the wings on in his hand. This place was as intimidating as ever, and the Viscount's young daughter covered her ears with a wince. It was always loud when they came to watch these battles. It was no surprise that Sister Fren and Freya did not want to come at all to watch such a barbaric fight. Meanwhile, Astor was busy thinking of his past life and hating all of the laughter around him. He recalled the fear that he had felt the last time that he had fought in the ring. His weapon had been broken to shambles, and his opponent had just laughed at him. The girl called out to Astor, and he broke out of his temporary hate flashback. His sister asked if he was nervous. This was his first sword dance gathering after all. The dark-haired boy smiled, saying that he was not really that nervous, and she did not need to worry about him. If anything, it felt rather nostalgic. The girl watched him curiously, but the boy just smiled. Well then, the Viscount could only hang around with them for a little amount of time. He had to attend the conference for a bit now. They were counting on him to look after Alphen while he was out. The daughter complained that she was a year older than Astor, and that she could look after herself. However, the boy just laughed because his sister was known to be rather clumsy. There were many people their age here. The man smiled and said that he should take this chance to make connections. However, the silent message was passed. The boy was not to let anyone learn about his 7 wings. That was to be their very serious secret. The boy watched the man go on, thinking about what his father had said. However, as he looked around, he could already tell that most people around were watching both him and his sister rather maliciously. With such an openly hostile atmosphere, there was no way to make connections. Still, the boy looked to his side and started walking away. His sister was surprised and asked him where he was going. The boy merely explained that he was going to find some friends. The boy stepped forward, and of course, he made a beeline towards the place where his past life siblings were seated. Men just could not let go of their egos, and it looked like he was looking to pick a fight. The redhead's evil brother looked up in surprise when he saw the black-haired kid come to them. The boy asked who this stranger was, but Ardu just greeted his brother Darius. Of course, he still remembered his name. It tasted like poison on his tongue. The boy then smiled and explained that his name was Astor F. Elmheim, and he was the redhead's younger brother. He had seen the redhead from outside, and now he had come over to say hello. The dark-haired boy spoke with such confidence that the redhead was immediately confused. Astor had been here for all of a few minutes, and he was already causing trouble and trying to start something. However, the blonde recognized the boy, and he laughed that this dark-haired hooligan was their adopted cousin, the one that the Viscount had picked up. Then the redhead realized it and laughed rather haughtily, laughing that this was why this boy had the nerve to call himself an F of their family. Darius and Grios were both heirs of the Elmheim house, and they were also the 2 rotten apples who had killed him in his past life. As diseased as their father was, these 2 boys had been the true plague of his past life. Back then, they had seemed so terrifying. However, now that he looked at them, he could only see children playing pretend and trying to act important. Astor was snapped out of his hatred by his sister coming over. She wanted him to come back to her. After all, he had already said hello to their awful cousin. Suddenly, a voice called out to Alphen, noticing that she was here too. It was her cousins, and they were laughing at the young girl, chuckling that she was not hiding behind her daddy today. They called the girl over to entertain them like she was no more than a dancer or something for their amusement. They gave her an order as the heirs of the main house, and they believed that she had to listen to them. Of course, the girl refused immediately. She had pride in who she was, and there was no master and servant relationship between the main house and the branch family. She had no reason to obey them, and she would not be their little dog. The girl huffed and grabbed her brother, dragging him away, even though he protested that he was not done talking. However, He noticed that her hand was still shaking. His sister Alphen had so much bravery despite being so scared. The boy had to remember that he had a family now and he could not take things for granted or put his sister in danger. Of course, even though Aster had calmed down, his cousin sure wanted to start something. They yelled that despite the fact that their father was a knight, he had failed to protect the king, and as a punishment, his arm had been cut off by his own younger brother. That jerk continued to loudly yell that he was so glad that he did not have that loser's blood running through his veins. The girl could not take it anymore, and she turned around, abandoning reason and yelling for her cousin to take back his filthy words. But now he had her exactly where he wanted her. He had no intention of taking his words back. The girl yelled that she would not let the boy insult her father, just for him to sip the drink and spit it in her face, humiliating her in public. The poor girl had wine and spit dripping down her face, and her cousin mocked her. He said that only useless girls who could not inherit the title kept being born by his uncle. Their father must be so disappointed in all of his daughters. The wicked piece of dirt laughed at the girl and told her that she was not at a ball, so next time, she should wear some rags so that she would not mind getting wet. That jerk had stained her beautiful clothes. The boy had been worried on the way to this competition. He had worried that even seeing those mocking faces now, he might not feel any anger at all. However, now the boy took a bottle of wine from one of the laughing nobles and stalked over to his cousin. Aster could not help but think of how glass he was. He placed a gentle hand on his sister's shoulder and then tossed the bottle of wine at his twisted cousin Darius. The bottom of the wine went spinning in the air, but the redhead caught it, which was so annoying. However, they were all the same pieces of trash from his past life, and without any hesitation, the dark-haired boy drew his sword and sliced that bottle in two. It came down all over the redhead and soaked his clothes with wine, humiliating him too. Now they were ashamed for the same, equal as all things should be. The main character was rather satisfied with how things were going as Grios fussed over his brother. The boy took a taste of the wine on his sword and sighed that it was just grape juice. Now that was a perfect taste for little baby nobles, and he figured that his cousins should agree. Flashback moment. Aster recalled back when he had to control his overwhelming power. This had taken place 3 years ago, when he was training with his dear old adopted dad. The man had told the boy to get his power and killing intent under control, or at this rate, he would accidentally take the life of his dear sister. The girls were terrified to see their brother explode with power, and one of them was already unconscious. The twins clung to each other in fear, and the last-born, who was the main character's age, watched in horror as their eldest sister tended to the daughter who had collapsed. This was the power of the 7 wings in its raw form. Now that the boy had grown older, his power was seeping out even more than before. To think that the boy had harbored such a dangerous power, just for it to get stolen from him in his past life, that was unforgivable. The Viscount had watched the boy's explosive power, wondering if he even had the power to control this much energy coming from the youth. He wondered if he could help this child, and also wondered if the boy even held the ability to control his own power. Now, during the present time, the Viscount had been busy in his meeting for all of 10 minutes before a servant came slamming into the office to tell the man some terrible news. Obviously, the servant was scolded because he had interrupted a very important conference. However, this was a matter of great importance. Currently, the sons of Elmheim main house and the Branch family were dueling in the ring below. Now this news immediately caught the attention of both brothers. Immediately, the fathers walked out of that meeting, going to see what the fuss was about, and also hoping that their sons were not disgracing the family name. As soon as the Viscount walked out, his daughter ran to him. He immediately needed to know what had happened, but the girl just pointed in a direction for her father to see. A huge crowd had gathered to happily watch a fight between the great Elmheim brothers. After all, it was not a sight that everyone got to see every day. The Viscount watched with concern on his face, knowing that, depending on how it ended, this sword dance gathering was going to get ugly. There were already a bunch of people gathered who were definitely looking forward to seeing just how ugly things would get. Darius was, of course, the idiot in the ring, and he mocked his cousin for being the fool who would dare to pick a fight with the Duke's house. The redhead yelled that his challenger was no more than a stray, born mutt in the end, and he did not know the difference in their power. Raising his hand high, the boy of noble birth happily showed off the 4-winged crest on his hand. The Duke's son was praised as someone on a different level, which was just as expected. Then the redhead grinned and demanded that the child show off his wing crest. He even jeered and asked if the fatherless kid was too embarrassed to show it in public after seeing the wings that his opponent was carrying. Our dude could run with that excuse, and he accepted it, saying that showing off a mere pattern so proudly was deeply embarrassing after all. He could never lower himself to doing something pathetic like that. It seemed that now that he had stepped onto the path of revenge, Aster had discovered the humble skill of rage baiting, and his cousin was dangling for his bait, hook, line, and sinker. More importantly, if the dark-haired boy won, he wanted his cousin to apologize to his sister. The redhead scoffed and said that was fine by him, because he was that overconfident. Plus, if he won, then the dark-haired boy would be his dog, and he would work the main character to the bone. Saying these audacious and high-spirited words, the redhead launched himself at our dude, offing manially like a crazy person. The boy braced himself for the opponent's hatred and raised his sword to bring it back down, their swords clashing together. The battle started, and it was tense. Already, there was smoke rising around them as dust picked up. The boy glanced with annoyance at his shaky hold on a sword. Although he had been reborn with his life's hayast experience, there was not a lot that he could do with the body of a 10-year-old. The redhead noble laughed haughtily, like he had won the world, claiming that this was the power of someone who had it, which was why he could display it so proudly. The boy launched again and attacked his cousin, striking like lightning, hard, fast, and vicious. The shameless boy's attacks were relentless, and the young redhead yelled out to her brother in concern. There was one very high-spirited onlooker watching the fight, and he noticed that the young Master Darius' swordsmanship was still immature. However, no matter how clumsy one's sword skills were, the overwhelming magic that made up for that gap was the advantage of those who bore wing crests. If one wing held the magic power of a candle, then the magic of the boy's 4 wings was truly an unstoppable explosion. The redhead laughed, asking his opponent what had happened to all of that bravado from before. After all, his cousin had so desperately wanted to make him apologize. Darius laughed that his opponent was all talk after all. If he did not want to get humiliated here, he should show him his power. The redhead leapt into the sky and brought down his blades towards his cousin. A blonde onlooker gasped because with this the match was decided. Those sharp blades came swinging down on the dark-haired boy below, and they came down with the force of the 4-wing magic, working in an attempt to break the sword of his opponent and bring him to his knees. However, the main character stayed steady, much to the redhead's shock and surprise, focusing all his attention so that he did not go berserk. The dark-haired boy had coated his sword with a sheen of gold energy, protecting it from damage. With the most mocking expression that the boy could muster, the dark-haired boy teased his cousin for talking way too much. With that, he whacked his impudent cousin away and sent him flying. Astor was brimming with power. It flowed from his being to his sword, and he felt so drunk on it that he could not get enough of the feeling of finally humiliating one of his bullies in public. Finally, he had the strength to do exactly what he had always wanted. The boy had spent these 10 years with the Viscount house learning to control his magic. He had waited this long just for the chance to get vengeance on Darius. Now, Astor charged forward with the hatred and discipline in his heart. He didn't slow his attacks or even try to pause for a second as he hit him again and again, waiting only for the chance to get his revenge on him. Now his eyes shone gold as he prowled that sword down, swinging it in the name of all those nights and days that had sent him crushed under his cousin's ugly and unforgiving heel. The boy pressed down against the redhead with hatred, and the cousin groaned under the might of his opponent's sword. The struggle went on until the redhead was finally forced to his knees. Grios could not believe what he was seeing. His brother was in the middle of experiencing a loss. This had never happened to them before. Just one knee had been enough to motivate Astor to release even more power, and he came down on the boy like gravity. The redhead was sweating, unable to compute what was happening to him right now. He had 4 wings, he should be undefeated no matter how much this boy pressed him. However, the dark-haired boy's gaze was cold as ice. He truly resembled their shared father in that moment. The more the struggle continued between them, with the boy exerting force on his opponent, the sooner cracks began to form on Darius' blade. The other nobles were now in uproar and shock at the thought that the Duke's son could possibly be defeated. No matter how they looked at it, the dark-haired boy had a chance to win this, and Darius was being completely dominated. Yeah, that was what the main character loved to hear, and he did not once let up his pressure. The people murmured in amazement to see that the Elmheims still had someone like that in their family. The boy pushed forward, pressing down with all of his might to annihilate his cousin in this battle, and the Viscount swore that this was a difficult situation. His goal was to keep the young boy hidden for as long as possible so that he would not capture his brother's attention. The redhead groaned as his sword continued to crack even more and more, and the boy was filled with the image of how Darius had once happily chopped off his arm on the day that he died. Astor would never forget the redhead's laughter in the face of his agony. That memory was pushing him to the verge of losing his mind. He wanted to make the redhead pay, and his vision already started blacking out, the depths of his power pulling from him as he slowly began to lose concentration and focus. At this rate, he would hurt the crowd, and his true nature would be exposed to all. The redhead begged for him, so to speak, but of course, Astor had no intention or even drive to listen to him. The boy pushed more, unable to find satisfaction until his cousin was groveling or maybe dead. Then someone called out his name from above. There was a flash of blue, and something seemed to interfere with the fight. The high-spirited man who had been watching frowned as he stared on, and as the dust settled before the two fighters, a sword broke apart and scattered. Not only had the redhead been so soundly defeated, faced by the dark-haired boy's undiluted hatred, but he had become terrified and quickly wet himself. Next time he should wear some rags so that he won't mind getting wet. That was the advice that he had given his cousin after humiliating her. And Aster was all too happy to spit those words back into the arrogant boy's face. The expression on Aster's face remained contemptuous, and with the battle over, he sheathed his sword. Was not the wingless ash anymore that they had trampled under. Now, he had his sweet sister and caring father. Just knowing that was enough to clear his head for now, and he could walk away without trying to murder the cousins that he had once called brothers. The boy now found that he was able to return a happy missile to his sister. But then his eyes widened in horror when he saw something. There was a deep and dark, deadly aura coming from far behind him, a magic all too familiar that it paralyzed the protagonist on the spot. All of his past life he had been tormented by his cousins, so it was easy to hate them. However, behind him stood the man who had pandered all that time. The man he respected and begged for love now looked at him with hate. Slowly, the boy turned to see the face of the Duke Roderick, who was unleashing the power of his wings like a plague threatening to be spread. Now the boy was face to face with the man who had orchestrated his birth and ruin. The people were murmuring. They had just witnessed something that they could have never predicted. It had to be seen to be believed, because the youngest son from the Viscount house had somehow been able to beat the main house's third son. The people whispered, wondering if this had really gotten this bad. After having his reputation crushed like that, there was no way that the Duke would stay quiet, and he was already sending over his heated and rage-filled pheromones over to them. The boy stood steady, raising his eyes to meet his uncle, who had also been his father in his past life. The head of the Elmheim main house of the 8th generation was walking towards them, much to the delight of the defeated son. The tall man stood like a mountain with the way he towered above the young 10-year-old boy. Even in this life, his former father still cut a rather intimidating figure. When Aster looked at that man, he saw within him all of the years wasted and spent groveling at his feet, desperate for some form of recognition. His power also boiled, refusing to be intimidated by the man who stood silently and glared at him. For a while there was a quiet between the two as they merely measured each other with their eyes alone. Duke Roderick A. Elmheim was a terrifying man. Seeing that his father had come, the redhead leapt to his feet and raced to cling to his legs. The child cried out and pointed at the boy in front of him, saying that this was the filthy mutt who had dared to defy the main house. It was like Darius was completely unaware of the really pathetic sight that he made right now. The son begged for his father to use his power to put that mutt in his place, oblivious to how his father was steaming with building rage. Finally, the Duke moved, but it was unfortunately not in the way that the son had hoped for. His unsheathed sword came down on a hand, pinning it mercilessly to the ground. To no surprise, the hand that had been impaled belonged to his son, and his father had destroyed the part where his wings marked his hand. The poor redhead was distraught, and all the onlookers gasped in horror when they saw what had occurred. Even the blonde older brother was horrified to see what their father had done. The Duke was furious. He asked why the one who lost the duel thought he had the right to be grinning like an idiot in front of everyone who had seen him lose. The boy had dragged his family name through the mud. He should have no reason to laugh when he could not even avenge himself. The uncle ran forward at once, horrified at his brother's treatment of his own child. He told Roderick to stop his madness, racing forward when the Duke once again raised his sword, declaring that his child had no right to wield a sword. A sound rang out through the beautiful palace halls. The redhead stared in despair, the blonde Duke glared in hate, and the dark-haired boy stood between the mad father and his trembling son. Instantly, the uncle asked the adopted mutt what exactly he thought that he was doing. The Duke, head of their family, was about to cut down his own son before a crowd of onlookers. The dark-haired boy informed his former father that his cousin had yet to apologize to his sister. If his uncle so badly wanted to end the life of his child, he could do that after the boy had apologized to the Viscount's family. That was the only reason he stood in the way. The Duke scoffed because he had heard of the orphan who was picked up by Highfried, and he glared down at the child, who was acting like he was now a part of the Elmheim family. Like it or not, the boy was indeed a part of this family. He was the Viscount's son, even without blood ties. He had been thoroughly taught by his father about a knight's pride and the weight of inheriting a house. The Duke glared at his brother and child, who still stood nearby. He was clearly disgusted by the care surrounding the other half of his family, which he interpreted as nothing more than weakness. A member of the Viscount house had needlessly damaged the main house's reputation by beating his son in a duel. They were the pinnacle of 12,000 knights under their banners and the king's sword. That pride meant something, and the young boy should understand that this was not a matter that could so easily be dismissed as just a children's quarrel. Even the onlookers knew that, as they watched curiously how this conversation would unfold. The Viscount had offered up one arm as the price for his disloyalty to the crown, and the Duke's sword now grazed the boy's neck. He asked the child what he would offer. Aster was not about to fall into a stout trap like that. With all due respect, this was not a brotherly quarrel, but a legitimate duel, and he had been the winner. He had simply answered with his sword the insults against their Viscount house. He was not backing down, nor was he accepting any form of punishment for the sake of their pride. That was something they should probably sort out by themselves. Obviously, the man was not thrilled to hear that, but that was just how things were. One who could not even avenge himself had no right to wield a sword. Those were his uncle's words just now. In that case, the boy said that he had no intention of giving up even a single finger for putting his cousin in his place. The challenge between the two bull-headed warriors was tough. The main character had really taken after his former father, and he refused to back down. He had worshipped the man, so he knew him very well. The other onlookers could feel the tension from the interaction from the stands, and the young girl worried as she watched her brother engage in a verbal contest with words against their terrifying uncle. The silent blue-haired man who'd been watching silently so far had to laugh that this boy was only 10. But he had the audacity of an old man. Actually, Astor had the audacity of a man once betrayed, and he refused to be his uncle's rug. The Duke glared at the child, but the child kept the energy because he refused to back down. Cutting the tension like a knife, the Duke sheathed his sword. In that case, he told the youth to draw his own sword. The boy had barely 10 seconds to respond before the very pretty Duke suddenly drew his sword once more. That man attacked like he was trying to chop off the head of a lethal assassin. Fortunately, the main character had drawn his weapon by the time his uncle activated his wings and blew his nephew away. That was the height of pettiness in every form. The main character's sister was horrified, her hand over her mouth when she saw her uncle suddenly attack her brother. The Viscount was furious and screamed his brother's name in rage. It was about time he did something more than just screaming. His brother had just attacked his 10-year-old child. The uncle did just that and leapt from where he stood, his sword raised to attack his brother, who stood like he was ready to cut down his brother if that was what it came to. The weapons of the brothers clashed. The Duke did not even turn around to block that attack. At this point, that dude was just aura farming his immense power and showing off because he refused to be insulted when there were people watching. The clash forced the uncle to leap back, and he landed before his brother. However, he couldn't care less about that overpowered arrogant buffoon. The Viscount's priority was finding his child. Racing forward, the Viscount called out to his boy, asking the child if he was alright. The boy's sword was broken, but the man stared in surprise to find his young child still on his feet and holding up his sword. The child did not lie on the floor crying or defeated. Instead, he stood in the pose of a swordsman, his weapon raised and his spirit unbroken. He should have known that his uncle would use an underhanded method like that, and he was generally unfazed by it. The hero's golden eyes glowed, and he glared at the Duke, who merely noticed the presence of the boy before turning away and ignoring him entirely. The Duke walked away, his son following close behind, and the Viscount retrieved his child from the shadows. It was not until the arrogant Duke had turned his back that Astor allowed himself to fall. His father reached out immediately and caught him, steadying the boy in his arms. The boy merely said that he had worked really hard to protect it properly, his promise and everything else. The Viscount sighed and told his young child that he was magnificent, giving him nothing but praise. Meanwhile, the Duke retreated back up the stairs with his son following closely behind. The big boisterous guy who had been watching the entire time laughed that attacking a 10-year-old boy was rather childish of Roderick. However, if he had let that boy say whatever he wanted, the main house's reputation would have been completely ruined. It seemed a decent compromise after all. Against the great Duke Roderick himself, the boy had made bold declarations and survived. He was indeed a promising rookie, maybe even a rising star. For that boy, this could not be a better social debut. Even to Roderick, his supporters were singing high praise of his nephew. The plump blonde even admitted that the whole thing made him nervous, wondering if the Elmheims would split right down the middle. The Duke Roderick scoffed that the age of upheaval would come soon enough, and it would be a storm great enough to split the world into 2 or 3 pieces. For now, he would let his weak brother retreat to his weak family, where they made a soft and happy reunion. It was a bright and sunny day, and a bunch of people could not help but gape in wonder at the sight before them. They were currently watching a very serious match between two people who were swinging swords as they exchanged serious blows with each other. The opponent was knocked to the ground, and the man could not help but admit that the other fighter was magnificent. The other fighter was, of course, the Master Astor of the Viscount's house. As usual, the boy had some really impressive skill, and he was only 10 years old. It was rather terrifying to see just how much he had grown. Ever since the boy came back from the sword dance gathering, he had been training even harder than ever. It must have been quite the motivation for him. Plus, they heard that the boy had even beaten Duke Roderick's third son. The main house had made them drink bitter medicine for so long, suffering in their shadow for years, so this was a happy, new and refreshing story. It was nice to hear that others were motivated by what had happened in the sword dance, but our dude was focused on things that held weight and were important to him. At that gathering he had shown enough power and presence. Things had gone entirely differently than in his past life, and the actions that he had taken would surely reduce the voice calling the Viscount's house a disgrace to the Elmheim name at least a little. However, his real target was, of course, still the Elmheim main house. Ideally, the boy wanted to test how far his abilities would go right there at the gathering. These were the thoughts on his mind as he worked hard to train his sword skills, growing faster and strong with each passing day. Back then, the boy had realized that, as he was now, he was not yet in any level close to beating Roderick. He could not let pride get the better of him just yet, and for now, he had to focus on getting stronger. In the end, wing crests were just indicators showing the amount of hidden magic power that a person possessed. Even innate magic was wasted if they could not control it. However, he still could not draw out the full power of the 7 wings. If only the boy could probably test out his full power to his heart's content without worrying about losing control. Still, the young noble knew that it was best to focus on the things that he could do for now, and he tossed the guards around like they were no more than bowling pins as he dueled with them. The boy turned with his golden gaze, and his opponent dropped their weapon. No matter how many opponents he fought, he proved victorious each time. The boy then yelled and asked if there was anyone else available to duel. Well, he had cleaned out the whole security supply, so of course, there was no one left to battle such an audacious child. His sister popped up yet again to be his personal cheerleader, and she scolded him for going all out against their guards. Her brother truly did not know the meaning of restraining, and their father was calling for him now, so he might as well go attend to that. The boy stepped forward, interested in answering his father's call. In that case, he would heed it right away. The boy paused and glanced at the outfit that his sister was wearing. Her red hair danced in the wind as she turned back to look at him. The dark-haired boy pointed out that his sister was wearing something other than pretty dresses. She actually looked dressed to duel, and it was unusual. He had thought that she did not want to wear that kind of thing because it was not cute. The girl scoffed that balance was important in everything. Watching the boy train so hard made her realize that she could not stay the same way either. She also would prefer to be able to defend herself. After all, her younger brother was working so hard. In that case, when he got back, the girl informed him that he would be keeping her company. The dark-haired boy laughed with joy. He sure loved spending time with his sister, and he told her to go easy on him. There was a knock on the door, and the boy stepped in to greet his adopted father. The boy asked his father what he was needed for, and the Viscount raised his head with a very serious expression on his face. The old man first told his little boy to have a seat, and our dude sat as commanded. Now, it had been 10 years since this little boy had been welcomed into their family. The man had thought about waiting a little longer until the boy was older. However, the boy had proven that he was ready now. Something was set on the table, and the youth asked what he had been given. It was a beautiful red ring. The man introduced his son to the proof that he was the next head of the house. From now on, the Viscount announced that he wanted Astor to inherit the Viscount house. The dark-haired youth was shocked by this conversation, as the boy knew the Viscount house was in a delicate position, but they were still a branch family bearing the Elmheim family name, and as lords governing a territory, they had much to protect. They could not leave the next head of the house position vacant forever, since that could only be filled by a male child, thanks to the great and almighty power of the patriarchy. The brother, of course, was not rocking with this logic, and he first asked if his sisters were okay with this declaration. The man said that his sisters, who had gone to a kindergarten school, would return in 3 days. Then, the man planned to tell everyone. Well, this was a huge shock. His sisters Marfa and sister Kudo probably would not be crazy about this news. In fact, he was almost sure that his sister Kudo would be very angry. She disliked him because he just happened to be born a male and now he was getting all of the title and the recognition. He had to admit that it was not very fair to her. Olus, he had just so happened to be blessed with 7 wings. It was all a coincidence as far as his existence was concerned. The boy explained that he could not take his sisters right from them. After all, he could not even control his own magic. He was an immature fool who nearly killed his own sister during training one day, and someone like him had no confidence to convince his angry sister that he would be perfect for the role. He would rather withdraw now while the option was still available. The Viscount just smiled at his son's words. As the boy was walking away, the man mentioned that he had often wondered from long ago if this boy was actually a child, because he sure did not act like one. The man had thought that this ring would be a reward for the sword dance gathering, but it seemed the boy would be happier with something else instead. In that case, the man brought forth a different box and placed it in front of the young boy. The boy's eyes widened and he asked what it was that he was being given. His father opened the box and thus revealed the magic sword, Graham. It was a blade capable of controlling the 7 wings of power, because it was a magic devouring sword. It was also the perfect tool for his young and overpowered son. Alright, so the first thing the super smart Viscount did was move his weapon of mass destruction and the sword to a more secure area so that his son would not wipe out the whole neighborhood from testing his powers. Once little Astor was far enough from his daughter and household, his adopted father came to a stop. The boy looked around, noting that they were just testing out the sword. He figured that the training hall would be just finer, but clearly the boy did not understand what kind of heat this weapon was packing. The man explained that it was just a little precaution, just to make sure no one died when they unheated that thing. The boy had a pretty nasty habit of breaking things since he was a baby. As an infant he broke the roof, and when he got older, he started cutting holes in their walls. Even if they were a noble family, Fixing things around the house was expensive. It was best to do this so that nothing that had to be replaced would get hurt. This magic sword, Graham, was a legendary blade passed down only to the eldest sons of the Elmheim family for generations, which was the only reason his greedy uncle had not snatched it yet. The man had it brought from the main house for his adopted little boy to own. Suddenly, the man grabbed the cloth over the sword with his teeth and unwrapped it. Much to the boy's surprise and horror, the supposed magical sword was kind of broken. He could not believe that this was the sword that he was supposed to inherit. The thing barely had 5 inches of metal after the hilt, and it was kind of a letdown. However, his father explained that this sword had no blade, this was how it was supposed to look. When the wielder then channeled their magic into it like so, and the man did a demonstration by forcing his power into the sword. Before the boy's eyes, he marveled in amazement to see the sword. The beautiful red sword was completed by its wielder's magic power, and it was a blade of great potential. How big the sword became was entirely dependent on who was wielding it. Then the man swung the sword, and it gushed out red power like a waterfall of heat. That thing wiped out a good line of the front of it, carving it into an unusual shape, showing its might. However, with mediocre magic power, the sword was bound to drain the wielder dry instead, so it was actually quite difficult to control, and most people did not take the risk necessary to use such a powerful weapon. This was why it was called a cursed blade. With this little explanation, the man then offered the blade to his son and asked if he was willing to give it a try. The boy looked serious as he regarded the blade in front of him. He took the sword from his father and got ready to fight. Putting his magic into this sword would be a huge advantage since he currently could barely train with his full power, especially as it kept overpowering his 10-year-old mind. The boy gave it a try and pushed some steam into the sword just to be shocked when the golden power came rushing out like a 9-tailed demon fox. It was almost like the power was trying to consume him. The boy groaned as he realized that his magic was flowing into the sword on its own, and so much of it went in that it shot a beacon into the sky that could be seen by the estate. Some of the guards noticed it and wondered what that light was. They even thought that it might be a comet fall or something. His colleague sighed and said that it was the opposite and that something had flown into the sky. Those two were bickering back and forth, but the main redhead looked towards the forest and figured that it was definitely her brother. Meanwhile, the young lad stared in awe at the sword in his hand, amazed and in love with it. He thought that it was indeed quite the sword, but the old Viscount knew that the truly extraordinary thing was the boy's power. That shot had flown up and cut a nice path in the clouds in the sky. It was rather incredible. Fortunately, he had not cut the sun. Not a single person in the entire Elmheim family history possessed a 7-winged crest. If that boy mastered that power, eventually, he would surely become a swordsman far surpassing even 6-winged warriors like himself and his brother. Well, that was exactly what the boy wanted to hear, to be fair. His greatest desire was to surpass his uncle, so that he could grind that arrogant man beneath his heel once and for all. However, his owner that was too great, which would always breed conflict no matter what. If people learned that the boy had 7 wings, everyone would envy him or even resent him. Some might even scheme to use him for their own political gain, and others would seek to eliminate him as a threat. So, to avoid regretting his powerlessness when that time comes, he encouraged the boy to hurry and get stronger. The man stretched out his hand to his son, inviting him on the new and difficult path that he had to take. Because though the road was treacherous, he did not have to walk it alone. It was definitely comforting, and the boy reminded himself that he no longer had to live miserably as he had done in his past life. He thanks his father with a serious expression on his face, promising to master these 7 wings no matter what. 3 days later, the mother, father, and little sister happily welcomed home their daughters, who had returned from school. It was the 2 oldest daughters, and they announced their arrival. The older redhead cleared her throat first, and then called out for her darling sisters to come out and play, inviting them to give their big sister a welcome home hug. Out came the twins, but instead of hugging the boisterous redhead, they rudely sidestepped her and flew into the hands of their older sister, Marfa. Of course, Kudo protested that she deserved a hug too. However, the twins just complained that their sister Kudo always messed up their hair. The redhead huffed and denied such an awful accusation, pouting that she had perfectly mastered kingly etiquette and that she would never do something so important. Sounded like lies to most people. Then the redhead noticed her sister Alphen, and she beamed, hugging her little sister and asking if she had been such a good girl. The girl emailed and asked why her big sister had now targeted her, and now she was ruining her hair. Marfa also noticed their little sister Alphen, and she paused, asking where Aster had gone. The mother sighed at the boy and Kudo got a little solemn. Clearly, the older redhead was not a big fan of the sexism surrounding Aster in the family. The girl glanced to the side, but little did she know that her little brother was busy in the woods creating a very man-made disaster with his power. Power was gushing out of his sword, but he just managed to control the flow, and the boy took a moment to catch his breath. He groaned, realizing that he just could not do it. He could create a blade with magic, but suppressing it took everything that he had. Honestly, He wondered how on earth his father had been able to form a blade so fast and then wield it. He still had not figured out the trick. That was when his big sister Kudo appeared and noticed that the boy was busy going all out in the forest again. The dark-haired main character turned and greeted his sister, welcoming her back, and she scoffed that he had not even come to greet her at the front door, and it was very cold of him. Perhaps he thought that he was so special that he did not need to waste his time on such small matters and that they did not even matter to him. Plus, she had heard about his spectacle at the sword dance gathering. He was such a main character that the news had reached the night school, and the entire place just wanted to talk about her super talented baby brother. She was sure their father was proud. Every word that fell from her lips was just oozing with jealousy. The poor thing could not stand how popular her brother was. The boy sighed and tried to speak to his sister, pointing out that even as a trainee, she had already gone on numerous missions and excelled so much. He had also heard that she was the only knight to receive the honor medal this year. The girl huffed that, if she could not do at least that much, then she could not inherit her father's position. Yeah, the boy already suspected that his sister wanted the Viscount title, and he was glad that he had stopped his dad from giving him the ring, or things would have gotten very difficult around here. The girl had already heard the news that the boy had turned down the hair talk, and she asked if he was trying to be considerate of her. The boy groaned because not only had the father told her about that, but he had also gone and gotten his sister involved. Things got pretty troublesome when Kudo was heated about something. The boy spoke quickly, saying that it was not his intention to come off as patronizing or anything like that. He just did not think that he was qualified yet. After all, his main mission here was to kill his uncle. Everything else was just secondary business. The girl scoffed about how both her brother and father acted. They knew her dream, but they were still being so cruel about it. The girl paused and the boy stared, wondering what she would do. The girl whipped out her weapon and then swung it, shattering the tree in front of her. The dark-haired boy somehow managed to leap out of the way, asking her what she was doing so suddenly. The girl called to her brother, telling him to put his money where his mouth was, or in this case, his strength. His big sister was going to test him after all this time to see if he truly is not strong enough. She grinned and told him that she would be coming at him for real, so he should get ready. The boy yelled, telling his sister to wait, but she was not doing all of that baby nonsense. However, the boy did point out that he was fighting with an incomplete sword, so the battle was not entirely fair. Alright, but then the girl asked if he could make the same excuse to an enemy on the battlefield. The warriors did not choose when to fight. They rose to the challenge that faced them with their lives on the line. The boy was concerned about how his sister was talking, but she reminded him that a knight's creed was to always be ready for battle. She would not accept his excuses or his attempts to wiggle away from this challenge. Instead, she adjusted her footing and told the boy that if he held back a bit too much, then she would have no choice but to crush him. If he understood, then he should get ready and fight her for real. The boy was starting to understand that this was no joke, and his sisters were very serious about it. He was already struggling to just control his magic, and his sister was already airborne and flying at him like a missile. The boy had no choice. If he did not raise his sword, his sister would surely cut him down. So, the boy pushed some power into the hilt to form his sword, and he raised his sword to meet hers as it came down. The resulting explosion shook the trees. The poor forest was enduring the worst of this exchange because humans just entered a populated area and then created mass devastation, but somehow called it sword fighting. At any rate, the two siblings fought and called out all sorts of cheers at each other as the trees suffered. Kudo grinned that her brother's skills were as sharp as ever, and she asked if he thought that he could keep up with her swordsmanship, upgraded even further at night school. However, she did have to ask what the heck he was wielding right now. She knew that he was training, and she had seen the mana blasts in the sky, but actually seeing the broken sword threw her off balance. That thing looked horrible, and it could not even maintain its form. The boy had absolutely no control over his magic. How was he supposed to fight her this way? The boy groaned as he was pushed back by her force, her skill and her discipline. They kept fighting back and forth, and the boy growled, saying that his sister truly was not the kind to hold back. She could try going easy on him since he had yet to figure out the sword and how to fight with it. She had always been like that, even since they were young, because he was the only son in the Viscount house with inheritance rights, and because he was special with a wing crest better than anyone in the family. She always drove him hard and bullied him, and made his training so much harder. She was a storm of a sister who picked fights over anything and called it unfair, while he would desperately run for his life. Honestly, she was his natural enemy in this household. He had managed to dodge her first attack, but then his eyes widened when she caught up to him, telling him that he was as expected. Then she came down on him like a storm, her blue power bursting around her like she was a comet from the heaven as she pressed down on his struggling weapon. The redhead yelled, growling that the boy truly was not fit to be the next head after all. Meanwhile, Marfa watched from the window as her siblings dueled, and they all knew that they were fighting from the very suspicious bursts of red and blue power coming from a distance. The white-haired girl called to her father, asking if he was sure that it was even okay to leave those two bulls alone. The worst-case scenario, when those two fought, could be a corpse after all, and the oldest sister was rather worried about that. The father sighed and said that even so, the two of them are good rivals. They can be reckless, but it would not go that far. Since he was so confident, Marfa would try to believe in his positive outlook on life. Then she asked why the man had called them back from the night school. It was likely not just to talk about the successor after all. The man admitted that it was not and reached into that handy drawer of his to pull out even another object. The eldest sister gasped when she saw what he held in his hand. The man showed his daughter a summons from the Elmheim main house, and it seemed the old man running the core of the main house wanted to see their grandchildren's faces. In other words, both the Viscount and his brother and their children would reunite once again. This was a pretty serious matter, and the older sister worried. With the way things were, they could very well lose Aster if things did not turn out just fine. That was a very serious matter, and the two siblings continued to battle fiercely in the woods. The boy growled at his sister, telling her not to be ridiculous. They had turned down the successor talk. Surely his sister had heard that, too. He did not even want to be a successor in the first place. Still, the girl growled that this was exactly what she was not okay with. She raised her sword and brought it down again on his heated blade, fighting fiercely as they exchanged blows and hate. She was heavy, all of her strikes felt so heavy and large. It was like going up against a troll swinging a giant hammer, which was kind of disrespectful to his elder sister. Surely he could think of a different, beautiful, but also strong beast. That was the point though. His sister had the strength of a beast and her tenacity was like no mother. She did not let up. Nor did she show any mercy when she battled, not even to her little brother. The boy gripped his sword hilt, working very hard to stay standing upright so that he would not falter as he battled Kudo, their swords raised in the dance as they fought back and forth. The dark-haired boy begged her to at least listen, but she just pointed out that he had tried to run away. She was actually so upset about that she blasted blue magic at him, sending the boy flying backwards once again. The boy groaned and actually spat blood when he was faced with brute strength. He was getting beaten and battered by his sister, who was not letting up. The girl told him to draw his sword. If he only swung a sword, he was just third-rate. If he could handle magic too, then he was second-rate. Only by mastering both sword and magic was a warrior considered first-rate. He was such a disappointment, and she glared at him with dissatisfaction in her eyes. The difference in wing crests was the difference in the amount of magic that a person could handle. They say just one wing can mean about 3 times the difference. In other words, in terms of firepower and stamina, with 5 wings, she should at least be 2 steps below him, who had 7 wings. However, the boy was now struggling because he tended to avoid a straight-up context of strength. It was like he only ever got serious when it came to killing his uncle. Kudo wanted her brother to stop pulling his usual trick of running away from her swords. She asked if he trusted in his own strength that little, or if, therefore, he was scared that he would lose control again, as he had 3 years ago when he had hurt her the first time. The boy's eyes widened as he wondered if he truly was afraid of the power of his 7 wings. Fear was something that he had not really considered, but it could be true. It was a thought that had never even crossed his mind, but now he wondered if he was unconsciously putting a limiter on his own power. If this was the reason that the sword he was trying to wield now never felt stable, because he had been forcing his magic down too hard. The redhead was heated about this battle and a lot of other things involved in it. She was not crazy about the fact that her brother had everything that she had ever wanted but never had. If he were just going to waste that good fortune, without even realizing it, it would only make him arrogant in every way possible. If he was not going to even try to use his ability, then she activated her power in its full strength and leaped at him, telling the boy to hurry up and hand it over to her. The boy took a deep breath, raising the sword in his hand as he focused and channeled his energy. Then, with all the concentration that he could muster, he swung his sword in an arc and shielded himself from her next horrendous attack. The powers of blue and red clashed against each other, and the redhead stared in awe. Her brother had actually been able to repel her full force strike. The boy grinned at his older sister, thanking her for waking him up. With that, his eyes grew focused and he charged forward. Now the girl realized that her brother had charged into the battle without even forming a blade. She wondered if he had somehow run out of magic, but that made absolutely no sense to her. There was no way that he could so suddenly run out of magic. The 7 wings conceal an unprecedented, inexhaustible well of magic, and there was no way that the boy could control it all as he was now. He knew that much. However, for just this one instant, he would give up maintaining the blade and focus the magic only at the moment of impact. The girl grinned and asked if the boy had thought it through in his own half-baked way. However, the boy mumbled that he did not get this second life by chance, just to throw it away, and the same could be said about the power that he now wielded over his family and everything, as well as this sword, were things that he could never obtain, no matter how much he had struggled in his past life. The redhead stared, wondering what the boy meant by his second life. That was why, no matter what, the boy charged himself full of power. and he raised his sword high as he flew at his sister again. Their swords clanged together, or so it appeared, but the redhead gasped when her brother's weapon vanished, and instead he crouched low to the ground, inventing a new fighting style. He would not be holding back anymore, and he charged his weapon with magic. Kudo's eyes widened and she watched as her brother went full demon mode and raised his sword high in the air. The redhead somehow found herself waking up in her room, which was likely the first sign of how explosive that battle had gotten. The girl was speechless and wondering how on earth she got there. Then she heard someone greeting her and acknowledging that she was finally awake. When she raised her head, she saw who was talking to her. It was her big sister, Marfa, who was so happy to see that her little sister was doing well. That took a while, but it was good that Kudo woke up. Of course, the redhead had some questions that she believed needed immediate answering. First of all, she needed to know what had happened with the match against Aster, and why she was lying in bed like some kind of invalid. The big sister explained that Aster had carried her back home. He said that she had fallen asleep in the middle of the match, and that she must have just been very tired from the journey. That's all. The redhead looked down as she considered this news, seeing her sword but feeling like that news was not right. Aster had just leapt at her during their battle, and she was getting ready to respond. In that last moment, she thought that her brother had cut her down, but in reality, the boy dispelled his magic blade right before impact, and only residual magic passed through her body when he swung. If she really thought about it, there was no way that Aster would kill his own sister, but in that moment, she had detected nothing but killing intent coming from her oh-so-charming younger brother. She sighed at her infuriating little siblings, who were always acting so big and might when he was so much smaller than her. Despite thinking that, the sister Kudo smiled. Then, she called their sister Marfa and asked where their little brother was right now. The girl had only just regained consciousness, but she was already leaping to her feet and declaring that she refused to accept such a match. She just refused to rest when it came to training her little brother to be better prepared for the future. This time, she would go all out from the very start. However, the white-haired older girl just giggled and told her younger sister that their dear sweet brother had already left. The redhead paused in shock, wondering what that meant. It seemed that the young boy had been summoned by the main house. Rumors of his spectacle had spread, so just now he had left with his father. Then Marfa was surprised that Kudo had no idea that the boy had been summoned to the main house, and the redhead yelled that no one had told her anything about that. Meanwhile, the carriage took off and rolled its way forward, carrying the young boy inside. The main character looked outside the window as his father informed him that the people they were going to meet were the Elder Lords, who were supposed to be the Elmheim family from the shadows. Former heads of both main and branch houses and distinguished figures under the Elmheim banner. Even in retirement they held tremendous influence. The shadow rulers and the fixers. These Elder Lords showed no interest in him since he had adopted him, so it made the man worry that they were summoning his son at this time. The dark-haired boy reasoned that it was likely because of what had happened at the sword dance gathering. Hay had heard that the Elmheim elders value the family's reputation more than money or even their own lives, and those who stained that reputation often got thrown in the beast cages as feed. That family was hardcore crazy and maybe even a bit too drunk on their superiority complex. The Viscount was kind of concerned, and he asked his son where he could have possibly heard a story like that. The boy nervously said that it was somewhere long ago because he could not expand on his past life. Well, they were prepared for vigilante justice or exile at least. Still, the Viscount was concerned and asked if it was really okay for the boy to attend this meeting without at least saying goodbye to his sibling. The boy just smiled that it was fine. He was originally supposed to leave right as his sisters arrived anyway. Sister Kudo would probably relax better if he were not around, since she seemed to dislike him so much. Thanks to his sister, he had been able to figure out how to handle this gram better as well, so he was really grateful to her. Now, he felt like he could draw out the Seven Wings power even more than before. So, whatever happened to him from here on, he told the man to not to come and rescue him. He did not want his new father to endanger his title or their family, and he was prepared to survive on his own. Still, the father was concerned when someone suddenly yelled that he should not say such things, and he was acting so high and mighty when he was their youngest sibling. The boy's eyes widened, and he stared in shock to see his sister Kudo, of all things, was plastered to the window of the carriage. The girl had somehow run all the way here, and then latched onto her father's carriage, like she was some kind of wild beast. Truly, her strength and audacity were just outmatched. The girl scoffed that it was very cruel of her little brother to leave without saying a single word to his dear big sister. She had heard all about the old geezers from the main house summoning her kid brother, even Sister Marfa, and she had never been called even once. Now she was acting jealous again. The Viscount scolded his daughter, who had the full name Kudryavka, and he was sure that the girl understood that he could not bring her to the Mian house, likely because she was a girl. The girl sighed and said that she did understand and that the man had called her back to watch over things while he was gone. She sat beside her brother in the carriage and said that, of course, she understood. However, this summons meant that things were dangerous enough to be that cautious. Sister Marfa said it after all, that Aster might not come back. The boy tried to laugh it off as an exaggeration, saying that he was just going to meet with them and talk, acting like he was not the one who had been talking big about not being sure if he would return. He was not even sure if he could come back safely afterward. However, Kudo told her little brother to listen to her very carefully. She really disliked him. After all, he was male, he had 7 wings, and he always got special treatment. The fact that the boy was stronger than his older sister was also rather annoying, and the way he acted like he was all grown up, despite being her little brother, she truly hated all of that. Her little brother was just not cute at all in any possible way. However, he was still a member of her precious family, and no matter how strong he was or how mature he acted, the boy was still her little brother after all. So, she told the boy to hurry up and come back home properly so that they could have another fun match together. She would not let him get away with winning and running. Saying that, the girl leaped from the carriage and was gone. The boy really wondered what the girl had even come here for, and the man just sighed that she was a pretty good rival. However, the boy could not help but smile and thank his sister. This time, he promised to definitely come back, and she waved the carriage goodbye. So it was that the two rolled up to the Elmheim main house, and the guards, who were already familiar with the Viscount Highfried, happily welcomed the man home. The elder lords were already waiting inside. The man said that there was no need to show them the way since they already knew the path anyway. However, the guards were afraid that things had changed. They had been ordered to bring the two of them together without fail. It was clearly a political move, and they had not called them there to dote on their grandson. It was looking more like they had pulled the boy over to face some kind of trial. Still, the boy smiled, as it was kind of nostalgic, since it had been a while since he had last visited his old home. As they followed the guards, the old Viscount sighed and asked his precious son if he understood the situation. However, today of all days, the boy should know not to lose his cool no matter what they said. He had to keep his head and temper in check, not just for his sake but for the sake of his sisters as well. The boy said that this all depended on how those people acted, of course. That was exactly the problem with the young dark-haired man character. As he looked around at the boys training in the compound, he noticed that Darius was not among them. Well, if the boy got his dominant arm wrecked, it was likely that he would not bounce back to training anytime soon. His father asked if the boy was paying attention to his words, and the boy said yes, of course he was listening to his father, even though he had clearly gotten distracted halfway through. Just for today, he would be as quiet as a clam. Besides, his sister had already told him to come back safely, so he had to at least try to keep his word. Satisfied with that response, the old man continued to walk, and they got to the main door that opened. The guards walking with them announced that they had finally come with the Lord Highfried and his son as requested. Laughter came from the main room, and the 3 people in charge acknowledged their arrival. They chuckled that it had been over 10 years, and they smiled and greeted their grandson, Highfried. The man bowed before the 6th head of the family, since retired, of course, and the man acknowledged his great and revered grandfather. That was the monster that lurked in Elmheim's shadow, Zenith Elmheim, the 6th head of the main family, and the former heads of the branch families, plus the bigwigs under Elmheim. He recognized a few faces from the sword dance gathering like the plump blonde and also that blue-haired dude who seemed to never stop smiling. So, Roderick was not here today, which would perhaps make things easier. It seemed Zenith noticed the child looking for his uncle, so he informed the kid that the man was not present. The man was the commander of the Royal Knights after all, so he had more important things to do than to waste his time being bothered by such mundane affairs. That was why the old warhorses were kindly handling the paperwork for him. In the boy's previous life, he had never even had the chance to see this man, so he did not care then. However, to gather this man executives without the current head present, for someone retired, the old man really knew how to throw his weight around quite a bit. The Viscount got to his feet to address these mundane affairs, and the old man chuckled, saying that he was sure that his grandson had already guessed what he wanted. He had heard that at the sword dance gathering, the man's little pet mutt had caused quite the mess. As a matter of fact, the current head, Roderick himself, had stepped in and settled the conflict. The Viscount figured that should be more than enough show for the public. However, the old man growled that it did not change the fact that the Elmheim name, their brand, was scratched. They were acting like a pauper had just stepped on their luxury heels, and frankly, they had no intention to stand for it. Taking in a child of unknown origins as an adopted son was a mistake from the start, and they were willing to overlook it as long as the boy remained harmless. But no longer, since he had bared his fangs at the main house. It was a completely different story. These guys were so knee-deep in classism that they could not stand the current situation. They were saying that exile was surely the only answer and solution, and of course, they planned to make the Lord Highfried also face some punishment for causing disgrace to the Elmheim main house. Their politics were unbelievable, and the boy was really getting punished for winning a fight. However, the boy spoke up, saying that he had done all of that on his own. His father had nothing to do with it. However, the Viscount shook his head, telling his little son to quiet down. The boy had promised to keep quiet. and now the old men had found something else to use against him. They pointed fingers and declared that the boy clearly lacked disincline. After all, no child was supposed to butt into an adult conversation. They commanded 12,000 knights under their banner, and they carried the name Elmheim on their backs. However, the knights were not as one unified mass. Countless people eyed that top seat like hungry tigers, and some of those people were likely seated in this very room. Since that was the case, the old man said that they merely desired some form of peace of mind. After all, they were not being unreasonable. They just needed proof that this boy was not a threat to Elmheim. The old man pointed his sword's hilt at the Viscount's neck, and the man realized the blade that he was looking at. His grandfather asked if the man remembered when he failed to protect his liege and dragged the Elmheim's name through the mud. It seemed that people couldn't stop talking about that despite the fact that it happened years ago. Roderick had cut off his arm when that had happened in this very chamber. Now, the wicked grandfather was asking the man to sever the head of the child that he had raised in the name of the Elmheim family. The family was clearly full of so much baloney. The main character's eyes widened, and the old man said that if the kid died, then they could overlook the incident. However, the Viscount bowed his head and told the old man that he could take that sword and shove it where the sun didn't shine. The man would sooner gladly take his own life than cut down his child over something this stupid. The boy was amazed, and he looked at his father in awe. Then the old grandfather took a moment to consider the situation. In that case, the man offered that the Viscount might as well die, all for the sake of the Elmheim house, of course, and while they were at it, they would also be killing his wife, his daughters, and that boy over there. Every last one of them was now declared enemies of the noble house. In fact, by the net of the day, the Viscount house would be no more. Saying that, the guards in the surrounding area leapt at the Viscount with the urge to end his life. The man was annoyed as he saw the swords pointed at him, but the dark-haired boy kept his cool. Instead, he turned to his grandfather and asked the man what he was so afraid of. The old man stopped in his tracks, and the youth went on. Since they had sentenced him to death for saying nothing, he might as well get some things off his chest. He thought that it was rather pathetic for a room full of grown men to huddle together and tremble over a 10-year-old boy. If they were that scared of getting bitten by their own dog, then they could go ahead and exile him and kill him. He didn't care either way. However, if this so-called noble family intended to lay a hand on his own family, then the young boy grabbed something tied to his shirt. As he did that, he made a silent apology to his father. He knew that he was truly not good at keeping his mouth shut. The guard started in horror as the boy revealed the 7-wing crest on his back to everyone in the hall. If they dared to try to hurt his family, then he swore that these 7 wings would forever become Elmheim's enemy, so they should think very carefully about their next move. Now, all the people around stared at that child with shock and alarm, seeing something that they had never seen before. It was a child with 7 wings on his back. One of the old losers yelled that it had to be a fake. For 100 years, that mark had never appeared on a human, and yet that crest was also unmistakable. The old man croaked and called out to the boy, asking him if he understood what this meant to show that here and now. The child said that he did indeed understand, and he smirked. He had way more wings than anyone else, and he was sure that even more people would freak out about the power that he now possessed. His great-grandfather had been the one to call all of their allies over here, and the blue-haired noble could not help but laugh and clap at the boy's audacity. They glared at the dude, but he just laughed, saying that it was his bad luck that he found everything going on right now so very amusing. Wing crests were magic organs given to humans long ago by spirits. By passing that power down from child to child, humans deepened that strength over generations, yet no one had ever reached the 7 wings, except for one. The clan of spirits was the source of all wing crests. Then, the boy asked if he belonged to that spirit clan. If his 7 wings were genuine, then perhaps the boy did come from that clan. Now there was silence as they considered all that had been learnt. So, his father must have found a woman from the clan and impregnated her, so that he could bear a son and then harvest his wings. However, the dark-haired boy turned to the old man and declared that he was the Viscount's son. At this point, he did not care where he was born. All he wanted to know right now was whether or not this whole room was ready to be his enemy. If Elmheim cast him out, then there would be plenty of knightly houses eager to welcome him and his family, and they would all go there. In that case, the boy had become a massive threat to the old man, who already feared rebellion so much. If anything, that old man should want to keep him close at hand, as the 7 wings that might one day even surpass the power of the almighty Duke Roderick. The boy was really going to step on a lot of toes, but they had already sentenced him to death, so truly he had very little to lose in this confrontation. This was a game that they had started, and it would play out however he wanted, but he was not going to waste his second chance at life. So, he waited for the old man to make his move. As his great-grandfather said, Elmheim was not a single unified block, so rebellions would definitely happen. A huge civil war that would drag the whole kingdom into it would eventually erupt, and he had already seen that happen in the future. If he wanted himself and the Viscount house to survive from here on, then he needed to at least figure out right who was going to be his enemy and who would be his ally. even if it meant taking some risk. He was tossing the ball court to every single person sitting in that room, and his great-grandfather was furious about it. It seemed this little boy thought that he was worth a lot. He also seemed to believe that his 7 wings were real. However, the boy said that if his grandfather was so sure that they were fake, then he could go ahead and try to kill him. In that case, it would be a war between him and everyone seated in that room. It was a gamble, and the old man glared at the little boy who dared to challenge him. Sure, if Elmheim got serious, someone like him would be easy to kill right now. He waited to see if the old man would take the bait. There was clapping again in the great hall, and once again it was the usual offender. However, this time the man got up as he sighed that things were starting to go in circles. If that was the case, then the man suggested that they set a trial for the boy with the 7 wings. Count Maze was his name, and the other elders protested, but he said that the others surely wanted to see it too. The power of 7 wings. It would not be too late to decide what to do with him after that. Besides, they were in a mansion that belonged to the greatest warrior clan, and he was sure that they had 1 or 2 suitable trials prepared. Count Maze, the boy, focused on the one who dared to speak up for him in some form. No doubt about it, that guy was on his side. Alright, so our dude had just 1 ally so far, which could work. The old man laughed as he had finally found an easy way out. In that case, he told the boy to come with him. It was also a grandfather's duty to give a cheeky grandchild a very good lesson. So, they went to the trial ground that looked very much like some kind of underground dungeon. It was pretty dark in there, but the old man said that beyond this darkness was an underground bunker that was also connected to a waterway. They explained that it used to be an emergency shelter, but now they keep a magic beast down there. The boy's trial was to defeat the beast, which should be enough to expose the true depths of his so-called power. The Viscount sighed that his son was such a troublesome brat, and he had told the boy to keep those 7 wings hidden. However, the boy just smiled that something this flashy could not stay hidden forever. Besides, this was the perfect chance. His father reminded him not to let his guard down, soft, doting, and kind. His father was very kind. The boy assured his dad that he would be back soon, and with that, he swung down into the underground bunker, using the chains to guide his path. As he slipped down, he noticed the Lord Maze watching him with a smile. Soon the boy's feet hit the water at the bottom of the pool. It was really dark in there, and he looked around. Fortunately, it was not so dark that he could not see. Suddenly, his eyes widened as he saw the poor, unfortunate head of Darius, the son of Lord Roderick. He could hear the old man talking about how he had given the boy a chance to redeem himself. The red head with the 4 wings had not been able to beat this monster, which meant for sure that the youth was facing a rather formidable foe. Right to the end, poor Darius had just screamed and bawled until he died. Well, he was just a kid after all. Anyone would expect a child to scream and cry in a situation like that. The old man then said that he hoped this new offering would not disappoint him like that. Now, Astor raised his gaze and looked at the hulking blue magical beast in front of him. It was truly a terrifying-looking creature. The boy got ready and unsheathed his sword. As soon as he did, the monster spotted him and then charged him like a raging bull. The boy had to brace himself because the trial had begun. So, the rumor was indeed true that Elmheim kept a magic beast in their mansion. The big blue devil looked much like a lion, and just this once, the main character actually felt bad for the poor Darius. Being born into this house full of monsters, the poor boy had probably not received comfort, love, or understanding from a lot of people. The lion beast roared loudly, and the boy raised his sword as the beast charged right at him. That monster that had torn the poor Darius into pieces leaped at our boy Astor. The main character only had to strike once. So many pieces of that possibly expensive magic beast fell apart at once. The onlookers could not help but gasp in shock when they saw how quickly the young boy had dispatched that monster. To the boy, his big sister Kudo was way scarier than some wild beast locked in a cage. However, he paused when he saw something weird bubbling out of the defeated beast. The boy turned in shock with his eyes wide to see that some weird purple tentacles were leaking out of the lion beast. It seemed that this weird creature was not just any magical beast, it was an undead. No wonder poor Darius had lost to it even with his 4 wings. The even uglier creature roared in rage, and the Viscount was not having it. He could not believe that they sent his precious 10-year-old son into a pit with an undead monster. The man yelled and asked, rather reasonably, why something that sick and twisted was even under the mansion at all. His family really had a collection of very sick and twisted hobbies. They claimed that those things were drawn to the smell of death, so it just showed up down there, thinking it would find plenty of fresh corpses to eat. It would not die no matter how much they cut or burned the thing, so they had captured it as a perfect opponent for testing strength. Thanks to that, they did not have trouble getting rid of bodies anymore, since the sick creature in their dungeons would just eat them. That stupid explanation did not sound even slightly sane. They had just sent a 10-year-old to fight against a creature that not even adults could kill. Even skilled knights could barely manage to capture an undead, but they sent a kid to kill it, and the plump blonde had to ask if the man was asking the 7 wings boy to die for nothing. The old man just chuckled that if that happened, then the kid was an empty bragging vessel that was of no use to them. A wing crest without power was not even worth calling a decoration. The boy could hear all of their scathing remarks, and honestly, he had a lot of beef to settle with his crazy great-grandfather. The old man even dared to chuckle that even if the boy died, there were still ways to make use of the crest on his back. In fact, for them, that might even be more convenient. In other words, this twisted old man was likely the person who had helped Roderick steal his power in a past life. The old man chuckled with his wicked mind, but Maze was not a big fan of the man's disgusting crimes. Instead, he watched the 10-year-old kid silently cheering him on. After all the big talk that the boy just gave, he did not dare die easily on him. The boy rogered that and focused on fighting. No matter how many times he cut the stupid beast, there was no real impact, and it was kind of inconvenient for him to keep fighting. Especially because the stupid magical beast kept sort of leaking all sorts of evil purple tentacle. Compared to a normal undead, this regeneration was insane. The undead were already dead to begin with, so to fully kill one, it had to be burnt in sunlight or purified with a holy weapon. If that could not be done, then there was the last possible option, which was to not engage. Basically a fancy way of saying run away. That was all great advice, but it was not like he could go ahead and do that while trapped inside a pit with that scary monster. No, our dude needed a different kind of opt-in, and if he just used the basic textbook tactic, then there would be no point to his power as a 7 wings user. The boy needed to prove his worth before the entire family, so he charged his weapon with his power, letting the red blade thrum forth. Then he swung with power, slicing the monster's body right off its leg. In order to prove that he was worth it, he was going to show off his strength by overpowering that stinking undead with sheer strength alone. The monster crashed into the wall from his blow, and the easily impressed blonde noble jumped back, amazed at the incredible display of power. This was indeed the power of the 7 wings. The other nobles yelled and tried to see what was going on down there, because a lot of dust had risen to block their vision. Most importantly, they needed to know what was going on, and if the boy had been able to defeat the monster. Well, the battle may be raging on deep inside that pit, but now no one could see what was happening. The boy hidden in the dust smoke readied his weapon, and the old man groaned that it was such a waste. Just as he said, the lion's paw sprang up and hit the main character, slamming into him so hard that he went flying. The boy groaned as he felt the lion rest on top of him, growling and roaring down at him, while it leaked disgusting tentacles from various pores in its body. The Viscount yelled, the only man who seemed to actually cherish and love his children in the whole series. He called out to his son, but the Count Maze reminded the man not to ruin the show by jumping in to save the boy's life. Even if the boy lived, they would both be executed just like the 6th head wanted. Lord Highfried was furious and asked if he was supposed to just stand by and watch his precious son die. However, the blue-haired tease just told the man to hurry and calm down. He should, in fact, try believing in his son a little more. After all, when they looked into the pit, they could see that the boy still had a trump card left. The dark-haired boy was indeed smiling right now as he stared up at the leg of the beast that held him down. It was a really uncomfortable position, but he kind of did not mind because it looked like his trap was working properly now. The beast growled at him just as the fire within it slowly began to spread and consume it from the inside out. The boy smiled that it was a bit slimmer than before, but the blade of his sword had thinned out to form an even longer and more flexible blade that had now pierced through the beast on top of him. The creature growled as the boy strengthened the blade in his hand and then shoved it deep into the creature's disgusting and filthy neck. The disgusting thing spat out some sick-looking blood, but this time, Aster was not backing down until that creature was dead. His power continued to expand into a whirlwind that ripped that beast's body apart, and the Viscount's eyes widened as he realized that his son was replicating the move that he had shown him once. No, it was actually a different move, something else entirely. The power continued to swirl and grow stronger until it consumed the entirety of the beast, and then it kept growing from there. The power continued to expand until the nobles started to panic, yelling that the floor that they were standing on looked like it was going to collapse as well. The elder lord already started panicking and running away, but the old grandpa stayed put, his hand resting on his staff as he glared down at the battle inside the pit. Seeing the huge power expand around the 10-year-old boy, the old man acknowledged the great and almighty power of the 7 wings. The plump blonde was crawling all over the floor, and he asked if the madness and the shaking had calmed down yet, also asking what on earth had just happened, and asking where the magic beast had gone. The entire iron area had been undone, and most of the nobles had fled. The grandpa was still there because he happened to be a dedicated hatter. He had seen that the child had dragged the undead, which did not die easily, into a vortex of magic and ground that beast to dust. The boy lay on the floor feeling very satisfied. His blade had a very odd form around it now. Not even a proper technique, just brute force relying on the quality and volume of his magic. This was truly a feat that only a 7 wings warrior could pull, and the boy raised his sword high in victory. The old man asked his grandson if teaching the boy that move was his doing as well. Highfried said it was not, and he was just as shocked about his son's growth as all the men gathered here. The Count Maze then took the opportunity to remind the elders of their deal and asked if the boy had passed the test. The grumpy old man was kind of loath to admit defeat so quickly, but no one could deny the feat of strength that they had just witnessed, and it had even sent them running. The old man doubted that anyone there would object to the results that they had seen with their own eyes. The boy truly did possess the 7 wings. Maze then happily shouted down to Aster, informing the young boy that he had passed after all. He should hurry up and come back now, his father was waiting for him. Well, about that, the boy pointed out that the chain that he had used to climb down had gotten disintegrated by the vortex that he had summoned, so he would appreciate it if someone would lower him down a rope. Well, with all of that madness over and done with, everyone went back to the meeting hall, and the old man asked the boy what he wanted now that he had proved his point. The boy would not get a second chance at this, but the boy insisted that he was not interested in fighting for the main house's succession anyway. If someone like him wandered freely around the mansion, his dear cousins would not be able to relax. Besides, he happened to enjoy the very peaceful life that he was living with his siblings in the branch house. His place was still that home in the Viscount's house, and he had proven that he was willing to fight to protect it. The old man laughed and asked the young boy if he called that modesty. The boy could not fool him. The old man could see the ambition in the young boy's eyes. The boy intended someday to turn his blade on Elmheim itself. The boy was shocked, and his great-grandfather then asked if Roderick's head was his target. Well, that was a rather delicate matter that the boy did not really want to address, but his silence told the old man all that he wanted to hear. The grandpa chuckled and told the young boy not to tense up like that. He gave too much away when he reacted in such an obnoxious manner. He was not here to pry into their true intentions, not at this point. The boy paused, wondering why this old man had a change of heart. Rebels were his enemies after all, so he expected a bit more heat about his camouflaging against the current head of the Elmheim house. However, the old man just smiled and said that they were not all of one mind either. Roderick was a bit too strong-willed for the old man's liking. If the boy's existence became a check on the man's arrogance, then that was rather convenient for them. However, if the boy dared to bare his fangs at the old man again, well, he would not take it kindly to that, and would probably find ways to cut the young boy down. They all knew that his weakness was his family after all, but they also knew that his family was his trigger, so they had to tread cautious. The boy understood the gist of what that conversation meant. At any rate, he was done talking about Elmheim with that old monster, and it was time for him to retreat to stuff that brought him peace. His father was waiting for him, and he asked his young son what the elders had said. Now, Maze was not evading the fact that he had chosen to ally with the young Aster. The boy explained that they had offered to bring him to the main house, but he had turned them down. The Viscount was surprised to hear that, and the Count said that it was such a shame. If the boy had officially become a main house ward, then he could have enjoyed a far more privileged life. Now, the boy did want to speak with his new ally. He asked why the man had suggested something that ended up helping him. The man smirked that he had no idea what the boy meant. He had simply felt like teasing an annoyingly cocky child. Alright, so that dude was not going to provide a strange answer. Or our dude could live with that. More importantly, Maze knew that from today, the boy was officially recognized as the 7 Wings boy in name and fact. The blue-eyed noble smiled, telling the boy to look around at how the air had changed around him. Now, most of the nobles in the hall were taking a peek at him, all of them whispering about how they wanted the child to be theirs. Some were even thinking of eliminating him before he became an obstacle. However, since he was a child, some also figured there would be a way to use him. All of this scheming should surely tire them out. As the boy had said, the 7 Wing crest had tremendous name value all on its own. From now on, more and more people would be coming after him in many different ways. The boy asked if Count Maze was going to be one of those who came after him. The blue-haired noble paused at the question. Then he smirked, as he also happened to sit on the board of the Knight Academy. Scouting promising youths and staking a claim on them was part of his job. The same went for that plump and blonde gentleman over there. That was why they were already looking forward to the day that the boy would enroll with them and hopefully start showing some interest in any female who was not his sister. Until then, he would meet Aster again. That guy was kind of hard to read, but our dude did not think of him as his enemy, so he could work with the way things were for now. Still, it was too soon to decide if that dude was his ally. However, all of that could be a question for another day. The man placed his hand on the boy's shoulder and told him that they should head home too. The boy's grand performance today was likely something that his sisters would want to hear all about. The boy smiled and said that when she saw his wound, his mother would likely faint on the spot. Still, the boy smiled brightly as he followed his father. The captain of the knights was informed about the situation where the young Master Darius lost his life during a trial given by the Lord Zenith. The man did not seem really moved by it, so they also informed him that Highfried's boy was summoned along with the old men of the main house. He needed to know what was the outcome of that meeting. The matter of his own son did not even matter to him. The man was cold as usual. However, there was a report on that as well, and it turned out that the boy really did hold the 7 wings on his back. The knight was surprised to see that Duke Roderick already knew. Of course, he knew, and he was also aware that if they left things as they were, then the long-held power balance within Elmheim might collapse. The knight asked if they should take some kind of action, but the man told them to leave things as they were. If Elmheim could be shaken by an obstacle of this level, then it would have crumbled a long time ago. Besides, sooner or later, the man believed that those 7 wings would be his. He was such an arrogant, awful person. Until then, he would let the boy roam free, and he would see how far that infant he failed to catch back then could struggle and entertain him for a while. To the awful and wicked blonde man, the boy was still Ash, child of 7 wings. 4 years later, applicants for the Dorlathil Knight Academy entrance exam were asked to please line up at the desk. All sorts of knights from noble houses had come to apply, and once they were done filling out the application, they should move along quickly. One of the men paused when they recognized the boy making their way to them. It was, of course, none other than the boy from the rumors. The men gossiped among themselves, saying that they had heard that the boy from the rumors was way more ripped. The kingdom and the Knight Order took no responsibility for injuries or accidents during the exam, and if they signed at that spot, then they agreed to the terms and conditions. Once they had signed, they were to show their win crest, as they could not afford to accidentally pass someone with no magic. First of all, that was great discrimination against those who could do quite well without magic. The boy had signed his name as Aster F. Elmheim, then the man on duty paused because he recognized that name. The boy smirked since the man had asked to see his wing crest, and he was all too pleased to have the opportunity to show that off. It was a bit of an awkward place to show, and he asked if the man could not just let him in, just because of his handsome face. Soon enough, the boy of rumors had appeared. Many had gathered around the white marble construct, and it was bustling with activity as many people went about their day. Our main character strutted inside, very eager to look around at his first time at the Knight Academy. Someone called out to him, calling him the stuck-up-looking guy over there. The brown-haired dude who called out to him did not recognize his face, so he figured that the boy had to be some kind of backwater noble. The brunette in question was called Bigger Smythe, and he asked the boy if he was sure that he had come to the right place. This was the elite of the elite among knights after all, and not just anyone could waltz in here. This was the selection exam for the Honorable Royal Knight Cadets after all. This arrogant loser was then promptly told that there was no problem because the dark-haired boy happened to be a part of the elite that he spoke of. Of course, the brunette did not believe it, and he even yelled for the boy to hold it right there. Everyone here had dragged themselves through hard, grinding years at the bottom, and even so, they kept coming back to take this exam over and over again, chasing the dream of walking the shining elite road. Aster really wondered what any of that had to do with him. He was just here, minding his own business and going about his day. This was the loser who was choosing not to leave him alone, and he refused to take responsibility for any consequences that arose from this. The brunette groaned and pointed at the dark-haired noble, saying that he had shown up here with that kid-sized sword dangling at his hip. This was not the place for baby chicks like him who had just picked up a sword, and he told the boy to hurry up and run off, no rubbernecking allowed. That was big talk for someone who had no idea who they were talking to. Other knights around sighed because they knew that the other dude had a practice for bullying the newbies who often came to apply. That dude never got tired of doing the same thing year after year, so it seemed he was a repeat offender. More importantly, the kid that he was pestering did kind of look familiar. He looked like the one that everyone had been gossiping about, the boy from Elmheim. The boy looked like he was the one called Aster, who was especially known for having the very unique 7 wings. However, the brunette paused when he heard that gossip float towards him. He had been wondering who he was talking to. Suddenly, someone marched towards the two, saying that it turned out that his dear cousin Aster had shown up. The 14-year-old turned to acknowledge his brother Grios. The blonde had barely changed, though he did look a little neater, and he was even faking politeness. It seemed knowledge of the dark-haired boy's status had changed his cousin's tone. How pretentious of him, especially when the main character knew that the other boy likely still hated his guts. The blonde smiled and greeted his cousin, joking that no one knew when or where he was actually born. So even with the power imbalance, this stupid blonde was still going to bring up unnecessary conversations like that. Well, it should not be surprising to find pigs digging around in the mud. Grios said that he was not even sure if he could call the other boy his cousin. The boy could finally speak to Grios after a long time, so he just said that he was sorry about Darius. However, the blonde just laughed that a disgrace like that likely deserved to die. Honestly, he even added that it was refreshing not to have his brother arrive. It was no surprise that Roderick's children acted like sharks who swam in the same waters, looking for a chance to devour each other. The blonde scoffed that his redhead brother was always throwing his weight around. Being just 1 year older, that boy had been a real nuisance to him. The blonde smiled that he did not care how many wings the dark-haired boy had, but the boy should not look down on the main house just because he had exceptional magic power and all that. After all, in night school, the boy did not have anyone to protect him anymore. No matter how one looked at it, that was definitely a threat. Two L-mimes in the same exam looked dicey for the other participants, and they could tell that this was going to be rough for them. The main and branch houses still clearly hated each other's guts, too, and no one wanted to get dragged into the middle of that conflict. Now the rookie bully was sweating because he realized that he was standing way too close to that conflict for his liking. The man hesitantly asked if the dark-haired boy was, by any chance possibly, exactly who he feared that he was. It seemed this boy was the son of Elmheim, but he just smiled and said that his name was Aster. In fact, his senpai could just call him Aster. That was fine. Thus, it came that the students all gathered in the first exam hall. The instructors welcomed all of them and thanked them for coming all this way for a very important exam. First, he would express his gratitude for their courage and patriotism. The royal knights were nothing like the provincial knights who swaggered around the countryside. They were the knights of honor that served the king, and they guarded the king as proud blades who would risk their lives for the king. This was declared very bold and proud before all the students who watched in awe. Putting it plainly, the school had no room for clumsy or dull blades, and they wanted all the students to think of today's exam like a battlefield, and to show them their true worth to the fullest. All the students listened rather earnestly, but the boy was kind of skeptical. He felt like the announcer was talking complete nonsense, but he had finally made it back here to night school. When he was wingless, he was not even allowed to dream of becoming a royal knight. Beyond this point would lie a world of warriors that he could never reach back then, and the dark-haired boy shook with wicked glee just thinking about it. Still, sitting at the very top of that world was the man that he wanted most desperately to kill. Roderick A. Elmheim, the supreme commander of the Royal Knights. The boy told the man to wait for him there, because he was going to climb very fast, no matter how hard it was. He could soon catch up to the evil dark man who sat at the top of the mountain that he needed to overcome. In order to get anywhere close to achieving his dreams, the boy knew that he first needed to pass this selection exam. The announcer yelled that they would begin at once, and everyone got to it. The first test was this, and a volley of what seemed to be arrows was unleashed on the students below. This was exactly why they had made them sign that form before they walked through the gates, because night school, it seemed, would literally attempt to take their life. A multitude of arrows came down, and it seemed like a lot of these students had not taken this application seriously because many of them were getting hit by the falling sharp rain. Some of the students panicked and yelled, asking how they were supposed to survive such a sudden attack. Many more arrows came down, and some of the so-called honorable knights in training were already ditching and running away, yelling that they would surely get killed. Some students grouped up with their swords drawn, and they yelled that all they had to do was watch each other's backs and block the arrows from each side. The repeat takers were a bit more familiar with the terrain, and it was a real testament to their determination that they had survived the test, failed, and then came back for more. The other newcomers were sort of struggling a bit. The survival rate for the first stage was usually only about 30%. Relying on tricks like that would hit its limit soon, as more and more arrows rained down from the sky. In truth, what they really wanted to see in night school were students who could actually defend themselves, especially with their use of magic. They wanted to see overwhelming solutions that could only be pulled off by those who had wing crests. As it just so happened, our dude was one of those awesome people, and the brunette from before was hiding and fucking away, and also wondering why the young boy was not using his dents and dodging too. Bro was just standing there like he was waiting for an arrow to hit him. The brunette wondered if the boy had somehow risen up and fainted from the fear. The blonde cousin of the Elmheim household also noticed that his cousin was not moving, and he scoffed, chuckling that he hoped the strong boy would get turned into a pincushion and die like a hedgehog. However, the boy just reached at his side and drew his blade. The beautiful red aura that whipped out around him and tossed the arrows away was like a magic dancer, except that the boy's dance was swordsmanship, and the red light was his sword extending. All the others who fought stared in awe at the awesome power of the boy, who knocked the majority of the arrows away. The boy had been trying to give the others a chance, because as soon as he unsheathed his sword, he then deflected every single arrow that came at them in a vortex of power. Smiling proudly, the boy grinned and commanded that all of the attacks be brought to him. Aster was all lit up like a brilliant red dancer, his magic power forming a vortex around him as it eliminated all the arrows in the ring. Bro was just showing off at this point. The onlookers stared in shock at the boy, who merely waved his hand and caused such a large eruption of magic power, wondering just what kind of monster he was to be able to do something like that. Not a single arrow even reached him. It was incredible. The boy was spinning his released magic to create an air current. Even the innocent toes were impressed to watch him do it. This was a beautiful display of incredible magic control. That power was wrapped around him and was creating a beautiful red storm. Aster was, of course, busy basking in all of the praise and acknowledgement. Bro was the main character in every possible way. Finally, the big miasma stopped, and the other knights in training looked around, and they wondered if the first test was over. More had ended up surviving thanks to the star boy and his giant vortex, but that didn't matter. The announcement went out, and everyone who had not fallen was considered a victor in the first test. The students were asked to look around at the fallen all around them. The ones still standing had clearly passed the first exam, however, there was no time to rest. Battle would not slow down for any warrior, and they would be moving on swiftly to the next test site. This was indeed going to be a grueling exam. The bully groaned at their demon of an instructor, sighing that they had just been standing under a rain of arrows, and now they were going to have to figure out how to survive the next big thing. Bro was clearly sticking with Aster because he could see that the best way to win was to hide near the shadow of the overpowered Star Boy. The boy smiled and asked his senior if he was worn out already. The man could not believe this kid was acting all fresh like nothing happened. That was how it was when a person got blessed with overwhelming power, to unleash that much magic and not even look tired. Even the instructors were pretty impressed by Aster of the Seven Wing. Next, they would see how the boy fared in a fight. The blonde was, of course, watching his cousin from a distance and hating him to his fullest capacity. He had received some special instructions before departing for night school. The boy had been told that no matter what happened, he had to stop his cousin from ever becoming a royal knight. This poor child had been given an impossible mission, and it looked like they were trying to get killed to be buried beside his brother. They told the poor kid that this was for the future of the Ilmimes. For the next exam, to keep things fair, everyone was asked to use identical swords. Before orientation, each of them would be asked to exchange their weapon. The other seniors sighed very heavily at this rule, and the young Aster asked curiously if this rule was a new one. For middle-class brats like some of them, their swords were not that different anyway. However, he was pretty sure that most of the fighters were wary of the seven-winged sword that could be wielded and made to change shape. Absolutely no one wanted to accidentally fight that. The boy considered that logic. It did sound rather reasonable. So, he took up the new sword and figured out the weight in his hand. As expected of his cousin, the blonde laughed that the dark-haired boy had already tamed himself a follower. The brunette protested that he was no follower, but the blonde just scoffed. He recognized the bully as the heir of the Baron House Smythe, just a third-rate country noble who could not dare to wag his tail at the wrong person, or it would come back to bite him. His stupid cousin was here displaying his all-out classism once again. The brunette immediately turned tail and tried to apologize to Lord Grios, basically kissing at his heels. The poor dude really had no backbone. He was even saying that he did not care about Aster at all. The main character sighed rather heavily as he saw the vibe that his cousin was working to create around him. Already, none of the other applicants wanted to hang around him, partly because they were scared of his power, but also because they were scared of his cousin. However, he did not have time to think too much about it, because it was nearly time for the next battle. Everyone was called together by the instructor, and he said that he would now explain the rules of the second exam. The situation was simple, and the second exam was a battle for territory. They would be split into 3 teams and fight over bases within this forest. Each base had a flagpole, and raising the team's flag there counted as capturing it. So they would be playing capture the flag, which was basically a team battle. Our dude was clearly going to have a difficult one with this one. The team that held at least 2 bases, including their own, when the evening bell rang, would be declared the winner. Damaging or stealing flags in ways that make them unusable was forbidden, but aside from that, there were no restrictions, and everything was allowed in capture the flag. They had to think of the sword that had been issued as permission slips that allowed them to cut down whiter enemies. Basically, killing was totally legal in this game. The man would now announce the members of the teams that they would be fighting alongside. This was great. This meant that our anti-social main character did not have to go around trying to make friends or get people to bond with him and form a team with him. Thus, each team was formed. And our dude ended up on a team with the brunette anyway, so his running away in the beginning accomplished nothing. The signal fire meant that the exam had begun, and each camp had 3 flags. To win, they needed to control at least 2 bases, including their own, however. This also meant that out of the 3 teams, only one could actually pass this exam. That was the truth. But the main character asked if something was bothering his colleague, who seemed to be deep in thought about something. The man groaned that it meant that they would have to fight the Ilmime team. And a lot of the weaker fighters were not really cool with fighting knights from the bloodthirsty family of Rage. The dark-haired boy was kind of disappointed in their nonchalant cowardice. The thing is, they were scared, plain and simple. Sure, they wanted to be knights, but none of them wanted to die in this battle. They were also particularly scared of the vengeance that Elmheim would be sure to try to wreak on Aster. They were talking about having to face a bona fide main house rich boy. Even if it was just an exam, pointing a sword at him could ruin their career, and they might never again get the chance to proudly call themselves a knight. It was kind of sick and twisted that warriors could not even do their job because of the noble politics affecting them. Worst case scenario was that they would get their whole bloodline wiped out just for offending the pampered blonde. Nobody wanted to make those people their enemy. Then the dark-haired boy asked if his teammates were giving up on the exam. They sighed that there was always a next time for them if they did give up now, and that was much better than throwing their entire lives away here. That was really pathetic of them. but they did not expect the main character to understand anyway. Weaklings like them were not on his level, so he probably did not know their fear. However, the boy had indeed lived a life of fear in his past, but he had never let that stop him from trying. Still, he had never imagined that he would end up isolated in a team exam. So much for having great team members. They had completely abandoned him without a moment's hesitation. Still, he could not exactly blame them. He had kind of forgotten, but to the knights, Elmheim was always that kind of domineering existence. They were basically a clan of tyrants that no one dared to defy, and Grios was the symbol of that reign of fear right now. The way that weaklings felt, well, from the outside our boy was just one of them, too. Still, it was kind of awfully quiet as he made his way to the yellow camp, and the boy wondered if nobody had started fighting yet. Maybe they were just being cautious. Well, if no one was going to fight with him, then Astor's best bet was to raid the other two strongholds and take down their main fighters as soon as possible. That way, the only thing his people needed to do was defend their own fortress, and he had till evening to conquer all the opponents on the battlefield. This was going to be one very tiring job. Suddenly, the boy heard a voice beside him. The opponent could not believe that the boy had actually come here alone. It seemed that things were going exactly as Grios had predicted. The main character paused, surprised to see the bearer of the yellow flag had lowered his own camp's flag. The other pale blonde smiled and said that he just happened to find himself free, and he threw his flag into the air, asking the dark-haired boy to keep him entertained. The dark-haired boy stared in shock to see that the red flag was already raised at the yellow flag fortress, and he wondered what was going on, though it was kind of easy to see. It seemed the main house brat had used his influence to strike a deal with the other teams and basically make them throw the fight so that he could claim overwhelming victory, which meant that the only person that all the teams would collectively be fighting would be Astor. The blonde chuckled and grinned, saying that he would show his cousin what it truly means to fight like an Elmheim, also known as dirty, cheating scum of nobility. The Royal Knight selection exam had begun, and they were now facing the second trial, which was the immense and ultra-serious battle for territory. Sparks of magic flew from as the boys battled intensely. 20 participants were divided into 3 teams, and the team holding 2 or more bases at the end of the exam would be declared the winner. In other words, raising their team's flag over an enemy base was the absolute condition to pass. Currently, our main dude was holding a battle with the warriors that should be defending the yellow flag, but they had currently dumped that battle and had hoisted a red flag on their territory, claiming it for his cousin. This was why Astor found himself asking his opponent why they had so quickly abandoned the yellow team. This sort of abrupt and terrible behavior was frankly unacceptable. So, they asked why he was flaying a red flag. The boy chuckled that he had, of course, formed an alliance with the warrior that he felt was most likely to win. He had sworn his allegiance to Elmheim, hoping to cash out on the political benefits that came with siding with the house. They were all a gathering of cowards and spendless jerks. The boy that he was fighting with currently was the famed heir of the Nolan house, which was the famed founders of royal swordsmanship. Christopher Nolan was a noble who possessed 5 wings, and in the first exam, he was overshadowed by our dude's 7 wings, and thus was unable to stand out in any way. However, only 2 people got through that arrow trial without even changing color, and those 2 were Astor the 7 Wings and Nolan. Those were the 2 boys currently clashing and fighting against each other in an intense display of heated rivalry and hatred. Both boys were rather outstanding knight candidates, but the problem was that only one of them could pass, as they were both on very different teams. The instructor watched carefully, knowing that neither boy could pass the exam, but he wanted to see how this would play out. The 2 fought fiercely, their blades clashing with the ring of metal echoing around them, while our dude questioned the Nolan noble more about this alliance that had been formed. The dark-haired boy had to ask the noble if he did not understand that only one team could win, but it seemed that the jerk was thinking the same thing as the cowards that he had to leave behind in the Blue Tower. They were going to let the main house win, especially because of that rule. Our dude was also worried about his new friend Smythe and the other members of his team. They were in danger now that Grios was targeting them. The boy asked if Grios had threatened these people, telling them not to dare go against Elmheim. Even if the boy had not done that, the other nobles were weak-willed and weak-minded cowards anyway. They believed that no one was stupid enough to stand in the middle of the road when they saw a carriage coming. In other words, he was comparing the Elmheim noble family of bullies to be similar to a fast-moving vehicle that could not be stopped. Knight nobles lived in a very strict hierarchy after all, and the confrontation that they were having now with their swords speaking for them was exactly how those of higher birth were supposed to act. They abused their power and oppressed the weak, because they saw no reason why not to. It did not matter what they did, because the weak would let them get away with it anyway. Our boy cursed, tensing when he saw his sword crack. It was bad enough that he had been forced to drop the weapon that he was most comfortable with now. He entered the ring to find that every weak-willed coward had ganged up against him to further the hierarchy of their oppressor. However, there was something strange about the sword that the boy was using. Now that he thought about it, he realized that the examiner had slipped him junk on purpose. Even though the instructors were working against his success, Aster could not catch a single break in this situation. However, the Nolan noble told the boy to relax. After all, they were still fighting one-on-one. Besides, the boy had never liked the Elmime bunch anyway, but he was still going to support their evil plans because he believed that was the natural way of doing things in their position. That was such sick nonsense. When the dude said that he was not fond of the Elmime family, he meant all of them, which meant getting the opportunity to know around even an adopted child was the best, especially a show-off like our main character. With another wick thrust, the boy rushed forward and broke the sword of his opponent. What a frustrating situation our dude had found himself in. Now his weapon was shattered and almost entirely unusable. However, gripping the broken, pointed end, he tossed it right at the other noble, turning his trash sword into a formidable dagger. The opponent ducked backwards, raising his sword to block that attack from being lethal. When he raised his head again, he saw our dude fleeing into the forest. The boy growled when he saw that and asked why his opponent was running away. He told him to get back immediately. Our dude could knock around trash like that at another time. There was someone who had to deal with it first. The blonde smirked, boasting that his opponent was probably scared of him. That arrogant idiot said that our dude was not even worthy of calling himself a knight. But suddenly, he paused when he noticed a shard embedded in the floor by his foot. When the boy picked it up, he realized that it was pieces of his opponent's sword. The weapon was cheap and tasteless, and he reasoned that giving the boy a pathetic sword was likely, once again, the handiwork of Elmime. It was a really pathetic trick. Aster believed in his teammates way too much, the way he went running back to them, calling out to Smith and asking if he was okay. The dark-haired boy had gotten back to his camp faster than expected. Judging by the look on his face, the cousin could reason that even Nolan had not been enough to stop his overpowering relative. The dude was speaking from a high wall and acting like a badass, and he smirked that he was actually looking forward to it when the boy said that he could handle this alone. At any rate, the blonde baboon wanted to show off because he had just claimed his third base. Everything had gone according to his sick and twisted plan. They had used politics, threats, and oppression to claim the 3 bases, but their cheap luck had until evening to run out. The winner was whoever still had those bases until evening, and our dude was not about to go down without a fight. Greos boasted that they were basically on the verge of total control, and he happily pointed to his red flag that was flying happily in the wind. However, our dude called out a warning to his cousin Grios. He asked the boy what had been done to his teammate. It seemed Aster had a heart of gold and could never stop caring about those losers who had not even tried to help him. Even the blonde was confused at such a question. Well, his fears were valid since killing was allowed in this game. However, the blind person said very casually that he didn't know where they were. That was when the dark-haired boy felt a sword at his back. His teammates were exactly where Grios expected them to be, sneaking out of the castle to surround and capture their own boss. The brunette that our dude was so worried about nervously told the boy not to take this the wrong way. They had already told him from the start that they did not want to get involved in a difficult fight like this. After all, to them, only idiots would defy Elmime. Grios laughed very heartily, and he had just about earned that laugh because those losers had not even slightly tried to resist when he came to the castle. They had surrounded us so fast. Even a bunch of country monkeys could still tell which Elmheim they should side with, and it was not the kind or forgiving side. The dark-haired boy then asked his cousin if he really thought that just having numbers was enough to win this. However, the blonde had to correct that naive way of thinking. Not only did they have an overwhelming amount of numbers, but they had already won. The win condition for this battle was territory after all, and currently, Grios had set up territory in all 3 places necessary for his win. All he had to do was hold them until the exam ended. Even if his cousin fought like a madman and ran around planting flags on every base, he would not have anyone to help and guard his flags. Their plan had been simple, and they had waited for him to go to another base, and they could keep doing that over and over again, raising the flag that he had dropped because he could not defend all 3 territories at the same time. As far as teammates went, he had absolutely nothing of the sort, as his team had left him high and dry. As long as they kept 2 bases or more, this was enough for them to clear the win. However, Aster was a day one hater, and he said that all he had to do was to make sure that they could not do the simple plan in Grios' mind. In fact, he was going to cut down every single night playing this stupid game. Now that was a very bold claim, but it was also the only way that he could possibly win. The other knights in the area were terrified. After all, anyone faced with these impossible odds would surely collapse and fall apart. However, the blonde laughed and said that the dark-haired boy was just bluffing. The fancy sword of his was out of reach, and the sword that he had been given was nothing but useless trash. Yet another thing that the Elmimes had tampered with to ensure their victory. Given these odds, and the fact that the boy was without a weapon, Grios could not see how the boy could possibly win against them. Even if he was the child of the 7 wings, without a weapon, he was no better than a wingless. Then the blonde laughed and asked if the boy was really going to try to take on everyone here. The dark-haired boy chuckled, telling his cousin that he had guessed correctly. He was rather impressed with Gryan as he drew his broken sword. He tossed the weapon aside, saying that his cousin had really thought this situation through way better than he had expected. Gosh, he was really impressed. This made the blonde grin with joy. Finally, after so much planning and disgrace, he had been able to beat his overpowered cousin. Unfortunately for those idiots, pride really went before a fall. Slowly, that sword trickled down to the ground, shard by shard, until it hit the floor, and our dude's eyes shone gold. He had a plan. Aster's broken sword hit the ground, the shards of it splashing everywhere like some kind of blooming flower. As soon as it was down, our dude moved fast, ducking low and neck-breaking speeds. One firm kick was all it took to knock down the cowardly brunette in front of him. With his guard disarmed, the man's weapon flew into the air, and our dude was able to catch it. Now step one of this very brilliant plan. He now had a sword to use, and it was not the cheap fake that he had been given before. Now that he had a weapon, the next thing that the dark-haired boy did was unleash his attack like whipping blows around himself, knocking out all of his betrayers in one fell swoop. The blonde got to his feet, acting shocked that his very talented and athletic cousin had not only disarmed the bums that had betrayed him, but he was still going to keep fighting. Grayos really underestimates just how dedicated Aster was to the hate game. If they wanted to play around with him, that was fine, but he was going to hate it hard until the end. The dark-haired boy raised his sword, pointing out to his cousin that showing himself before him was a huge blunder. Now that the dark-haired menace knew where his enemy was, in order to bring down this very foolish setup, then all he had to do was take the head of the king. Might be a kindness for him to do that as well, since his parents would probably kill him for losing to the kid that they hated the most. The blonde had overestimated his own capabilities, and now he was going to lose. The cousin called the boy a monster. Well, at least he was not corrupt scum like the blonde. Aster powered up immediately, his body just overflowing with energy and excitement. With the power in his legs, he boosted himself up and immediately made a nose dive for his cousin, who was sitting pretty on that high wall. Grayos yelled that it was impossible to fly this far while watching his enemy very obviously doing it. Bro should have honestly used that time to get as far away from his cousin as possible, because he was about to experience a very ugly loss. The dark-haired boy scolded his cousins, informing them that he was very slow on the draw. It was almost like he was not taking this fight seriously. Instantly, the boy leapt at him, powering up his sword with power and slicing up the blonde's sword in two with a single strike. At this point, all of that boasting was just embarrassing because Grios was not even living up to half of the hype. It took one swing from his side family cousin to bring down his weapon. The blonde was such a lame opponent that our dude started having flashbacks. This all reminded him of the day that he had flown for the first time and had broken his father's roof. Since he was originally wingless, he could truly feel it, the sense of omnipotence that filled him when he controlled mana. It took one hit to send his self-confident cousin tumbling from the wall. Having wings was so nice, and Aster took the time to say that to Grios in case his corrupt behind was not aware. That wall that had once been so high was gone, and now he had his cousin by the shirt. The blonde was panicking because not only did his cousin have super strength, but he also had gravity-defying powers, and he was also very angry at him. So this encounter was not going the way that he wanted at all. The blonde begged for the boy to stop it, and our dude figured he would, but he was going to raise his sword first and take some apology gifts from his former bully while he was at it. The boy who had once laughed at him and called him wingless in another life was now so low. It was the most beautiful sight that the boy had ever seen. The crash was loud, it echoed all through the forest, and smoke was blown everywhere. That smoke was so high that it rose above the clouds of the exam grounds. The brunette stared in shock, watching those two nobles go at it. That was definitely a terrifying way to fight, but he wondered what had happened to those guys who had met at such a high place and then tumbled at the ground. Someone at the back noticed something in the smoke, and he gasped when they all saw something. The brunette's eyes widened when the boy came over, dragging the stupid blonde behind him. Aster looked so cold with his golden eyes glowing with deep, empty cruelty. These people had betrayed him to support the noble pursuits of his cousin. The cousin in question was now battered and covered in dirt. He also looked pretty upset about the situation. It was hard to tell if he was conscious. The battered body of Grios was tossed before the armed men, so he was, in fact, conscious after all. And our dude then turned to the people standing again. Even while lying on the ground and looking like a whole mess, Grios was still trying to talk smack. He yelled and told the others hanging around to hurry up. They had no reason to be standing there doing nothing, and he wanted them to attack at once and try to kill his cousin. He declared that this was an order for Elmheim at the top of his lungs in the loudest voice that he could muster. Now the boys had to use common sense to take a look at the situation in front of them. The dude who was commanding them was lying in a discarded heap on the floor. The dude who had beaten the one that they rallied behind was standing upright, with barely a single scratch on him, which meant that he was willing and ready to take them on if they did try to kill him. Well, the brunette was a coward to the end, and he grabbed his sword. However, Aster asked if these cowards were really that afraid of the retaliation that they feared would come from Elmheim. They yelled that, of course, they were afraid, and they had every reason to be. This Smate's family was just a third-rate noble house that could be swept away by a breeze. A family like that did not dare to challenge Elmheim. If those overpowered nobles felt like it, they could end up crushed like ants, and that was terrifying for weaklings like them. In order for them to survive in this world, no matter how pathetic it was, they had no choice but to act submissively so that they did not upset that terrifying and all-powerful dictatorship. Someone like the dark-haired boy who has money and power and a title. He would never understand what it was like to struggle like that. That loser was making the exact same excuse all over again. Our dude had to wonder how many times he would say that before such pathetic words stopped coming from his mouth. It was embarrassing just listening to him. That being said, the main character just smiled at how pathetic they all were. The brunette panicked, asking what the dark-haired boy was laughing at. However, the boy just chuckled and remembered that his sister had once said words rather similar to that. She had told him that he did not understand the feelings of those who had nothing. Hearing words like that was funny considering his past life. However, he also had his own counterargument. Then again, those arguments would not erase the fact that no matter how one looked at it, he was currently blessed in this life. He would not pretend that this blessing was fake. That was exactly why there were currently certain things that only he could do. Pointing his sword at the blonde's neck, the boy loudly declared that his enemy was Elmheim. If a person could not do anything about it, then he would be the one to change it because he was gifted and powerful. This current arrogant and overbearing Elmheim that existed, the one that stepped all over powerless people and forced them to submit not out of loyalty but because of fear. An ugly system like that was the kind of thing that he hated the most. Aster swore that in the name of Ash and all who had suffered because of it, he would crush it. Those who heard him were horrified. It was one thing to be overpowered and an Elmheim. It was another thing to declare open treason on your family name in the middle of night school, especially when that overbearingly evil family was quite known for doing all sorts of evil things. The blonde was shocked as well and shakily asked the boy what he was saying. Everyone started asking the boy if he knew what he was saying, because his words were so revolutionary that they plunged the listeners into a very strong wave of illiteracy crisis. For him to say something like that in a place like this, it was basically a declaration of war. However, Aster knew exactly what those words meant, and he had said all of them on purpose. No matter how much these people fawned over and worshipped the current Elmheim, the only thing that awaited them at the end of all of their devotion and love was nothing but betrayal and a miserable end. He knew it for sure because he had seen it before. If they did not want that, then they had to fight against it. However, the boy was aware that fighting was hard. He did not speak boastfully because of his new and powerful abilities. These 7 wings that he carried on his back were surely the power given to him for that purpose. So, he wanted them all to choose as well which Elmheim they would follow. They could follow the ones who had been oppressing them for centuries and treating them like shit, or they could follow him. The listeners were silent after hearing this declaration. Obviously, to them, it sounded insane. And who on earth could choose between trusting a system that had oppressed them for years and a system led by basically a 14-year-old boy? The blonde yelled, of course, because he had to get his own points in. He screamed that there was no way a rebellion would possibly be allowed. He even yelled that his cousin was just messing with them. He would remember all of their names and faces if they dared even try to think of betraying him, and he would make sure that they all paid for it. This, of course, got the others scared. They knew what would happen to them if they dared cross the Elmheim air. The screaming of Grios messed with the listeners as they also considered the words of Aster, and the brunette grit his teeth as he came to his decision. Cursing, the boy dropped his sword. He walked forward, being the first to do so, and he asked Aster if he was really going to take down this horrible, corrupt government for them. If the boy just got their hopes up, only for nothing to change, then he would resent that black-haired boy for a long time. With a very proud smile, Aster told him that he had promised. The brunette was sweating when he picked up the dirty blue flag, and then he raised it high in the air. In that case, he was the eldest son of the Smates family, bigger Smates, and from now on, he would be siding with Aster F. Elmheim. The others stared in shock, horrified to see someone actually sit with that guy. However, now the others in the team were considering it. After all, Grios' plan had fallen apart, and he was currently lying defeated at Aster's feet. If they wanted to pass the exam, they could side with the dude who literally had the overwhelming power of the 7 wings. Siding with the boy was a permanent mark on their backs that could affect their line. However, the hope of a new future was compelling, and it made Grios heated to see them consider it. The brunette yelled and asked what everyone else was standing around for. Now was their chance to show those arrogant Elmheim snobs what they were made of and claim victory for their noble families. They would really not be getting another chance like this, so they might as well just take it. They should stand and bet it all on the 7 wings. There was a bit of hesitation from the crowd after all. It took a while to get over centuries of bootlicking in one moment and attack a noble family that could get all of them killed. Our dude was busy counting the number of people he had been able to bring to his side. That was 1 down so far, and he was not luring them with money, so if they chose to stand by him, they really meant it. Having one person was a bonus because it meant that the boy did not have to go around raising flags by himself, but it would make the job so much easier if some of the others joined in on his campaign. The boy needed more allies if he was going to overthrow Elmheim. The young Grios was on his knees, unable to believe what was happening around him. The fact that even one person would choose his friend was unacceptable. There was then one idiot who called out to Grios, asking if he was alright, and the boy screamed. Clearly, the Elmheim kids had not been trained in diplomacy at all. The only language that they knew how to speak was power and harassment. They yelled that the useless trash was touching them, growling in hatred that these people would even consider overthrowing Elmheim. Aster was just a member of the Mere and Weak Branch family. He was not a solid pot of gold, and he should have remained a non-threat to their line of power. The youth knew that if he let his cousin do whatever he wanted, then it would become hard for him to face the main family. He refused to end up like his brother, who had died in a pit and choked on his own tears. So, the young boy grit his teeth, growling that he could not let it end here. However, someone suddenly stepped forward and called to Grios, asking what was wrong with him now. He was looking pretty pathetic for someone that he had not seen in a while. The battered blonde raised his head in surprise at the yellow flag ruler Nolan standing by him. The Elmheim kid yelled at his ally and asked the other boy what he had been doing all this time. Despite being in such a pathetic state, he started commanding the other guy around and told him to hurry up and deal with the kid of the 7 wings. That was supposed to be Nolan's job. And since Aster was over here starting an uprising, clearly Nolan had failed. The blonde coward grinned, happy that he still had Nolan on his side to use and command like his attack dog. The other noble's wing badge might not match the 7 wings, but he was sure that Nolan would give the main character some trouble in battle, and when it came to swordsmanship, the blonde was definitely stronger than anyone else here. The Elmheim reject kept yelling and telling the other nobles to hurry and hack their enemy into pieces. However, a red flag suddenly fell on Grios' face. The boy was shocked speechless when his former ally informed him that he had actually come all that way to return that stupid red flag. Just as the noble boy thought, the Elmi methods were not chivalry or strength, and he knew that the other boy's sword had been rigged. It made him furious. In other words, Nolan had come all this way just to break his alliance with Grios. The Elmheim brat could not believe what he was hearing, and neither could the other nobles. They could not believe that the Nolan family was betraying them, and they did not know who to side with anymore. Since they were so confused and conflicted, Nolan decided to clarify and let them all know that they were back to square one. If Aster had really thought that he would go through this exam without settling things with him, then he was severely mistaken. The main character turned and found Nolan before him, hungry to test the proud swordsmanship of his Nolan family versus the 7 wings of the branch house of Elmheim. The noble raised his sword high, his stance ready as he prepared to fight. They would finally make it clear in this battle which of their fighting styles was superior, which seemed to be all that Nolan cared about. However, the main character said all of that nonsense was going to have to wait. He was currently trying to start a rebellion here, and he really did not need all of these distractions. Instantly, the dark-haired boy activated his edgy 7 wing power and smacked the blonde swordsman with a good part of his power. That hit hurt so bad that the blonde guy flinched. He realized now that with a working sword, Aster was on a completely different level than before. He was not playing little games now that he was trying to orchestrate Grios' collapse. Nolan glared in anger, asking the boy if he had forgotten that only one team could pass this exam. If they were both aiming to become Kingdom Knights, then they had to fight with everything that they had, and they had no choice but to settle this right here and right now. However, the dark-haired boy just sighed and said that this would be a problem for him. This was because he wanted Nolan, especially, to become a Kingdom Knight as well. This conversation was confusing to Nolan, considering the usual order of business was to crush everyone underfoot with no questions asked. The blonde stared in confusion, and the black-haired boy smiled that the blonde had riled everyone up about overthrowing Elmheim, so it would not be very cool of him to ask the blonde to give up on his dream just because they were on different teams. In other words, Aster was going to complete the impossible task of making sure that every knight on this battlefield would pass as long as they agreed to side with him. All the people there were shocked and speechless by this bold declaration. Even the Elmheim noble could not believe the boy's audacity. The brunette who had been the first to side with Aster was in disbelief, saying that surely such a thing was impossible, and he could see no way for Aster to achieve that. However, the boy just grinned and said that he could not guarantee it, but he was pretty confident that he could make it work somehow. However, he first needed everyone's cooperation to pull it off. So, first things first, the main character stepped towards the Elmheim heir, who was currently stuck in his own version of what was surely an ongoing living nightmare. The poor Grios stared in horror and fear at his cousin, who loomed menacingly over him. The dark-haired boy, however, surprisingly stretched out his hand to his poorly treated cousin and asked them to make up. By the time that evening fell, a new flag had been created, one that left all the student knights speechless. The condition for the win was for the flag that flew on each of the 3 posts to be declared the winner. However, Aster had somehow masterfully tied the flags together and hung them all so they could wave up in the air. All 3 flags flew free. No blood had been spilt, and no one had died. The instructor was baffled when he saw what was flying from the post, and he yelled at the students, asking if they were too stupid to understand the right way to raise a flag. However, the boy pointed out that the instructor had told them that the condition for victory was occupying 2 or more camps, as well as holding their own. However, they were never told that only one team could raise their flag at one camp, so they had decided to form an alliance between all the 3 teams and raise all flags at once. This way, they would jointly occupy all the camps. The instructor was furious, and they hated all that this stood for. The union and togetherness was going to shatter the delicate balance of oppression that had been built for years by high noble houses oppressing weaker noble houses. The man demanded to know if he was being asked to see all of the students, and he asked if the students were making a mockery of this night exam. The other students were already wavering and thinking that this would surely be the end of them. Grios groaned that, of course, this kind of twisted logic was not going to work in the terrible world that they lived in. The instructor growled that if the boy was ordered to attack and destroy an enemy territory, would he then go ahead and shake hands with the enemy and come back? However, the boy said that if the enemy had more value alive than dead, then an alliance would be formed. That was basic politics, to be fair. A knight of the sword of the state was not the kind of person who could make that kind of judgment. The instructor believed that with all his heart, and it was clear that he was a part and parcel of one of the many corrupt forces that upheld the intense hierarchy of oppression and pain. Then, the dark-haired boy asked if the teacher intended to disqualify them for following the stupid rules that he had set. It would be a decision that the examiner made on his own, letting his own ego overstep the bounds of an examiner. The teacher glared in annoyance, finally calming down during this back and forth debate. While his senses had temporarily returned, our boy rolled up, and he reminded this fool that if everyone was to fail in this manner, and this included the Elmheim son, then he wondered if the main family would really stay quiet about this. As much as that family hated its own children, it also hated public disgrace more. The instructor felt chillier the more he thought about a situation that would definitely end with him dead. Since that was the case, the great examiner had to go confirm the next step with his superiors, and they had been on standby for a full hour now. Honestly, they were really keeping these kids waiting like they were criminals being tried for treason. The other students were a little worried and wondered if they were really going to be okay. Others were worried that they were actually going to fail. But the main character did not mind. After all, he was loved at home. At the very least, they had created a situation that was worth discussing, so they would see how that went for them. The blonde Elmheim was a little shaken by how things had gone. It was not really his plan at all to end up like this, and he scowled as he considered his option. Honestly, our dude's new sidekick was very surprised that the little rich boy had actually agreed to cooperate. He even wondered what exactly our dude had said to him. The boy smirked as he recalled, but he said it was nothing really. Suddenly, the doors to the exam hall were flung open, and all the students rose. They were informed that the principal Mimir would not be announcing the exam results to everyone. The principal himself had shown up with a grave expression on his face, and the students were all advised to listen closely to his words. The principal Mimir would now announce the exam results. All the students were asked to listen closely as the results were going to be announced now. The knights in training gathered around and whispered as they saw the principal in front of them. He looked like a fairly ordinary man to the brunette, but the main character told his new friend to have some respect. The principal stepped forward, immediately recognizing Aster, who was the reason for the season. Thanks to him, they were faced with a truly difficult decision. Accepting a pass rate like this, with these many candidates at once, was completely unprecedented. There were proposals for a re-examination, but with the backing of the other directors, they had to now accept the dark-haired boy's claim. There was surprise and tension in the room, but the main character went ahead to break the ice, asking the man exactly what he meant. The man smiled and then said that they would be making an exception, and everyone would get to pass. This triggered a huge celebration among all the knights in training, and Griot stared in shock at such a result. The principal told all the boys gathered to continue to work hard, and to prove to them that this decision was not a mistake. Nolan looked very satisfied by this result, and all the students cheered with wonder and joy. Aster had a satisfied smile on his face because he had just hit gold and made world history. The principal applauded and congratulated the students on their enrollment with a big and proud smile. They were now all welcome to the Drassel Kingdom Knight Academy. There was a lot of wild and happy laughter and celebration that night. The brunette sighed with a grin, soaking in a bath at how incredible their luck was. The food was delicious and the baths were huge, and it was all thanks to Aster that they had made it this far. The boy was busy aura farming in a bath with only boys, showing off his charming gold eyes. The other students could not believe that he actually got all of them to pass. They even swore to follow him for the rest of their lives. Nolan scoffed that those losers who had been about to betray him earlier were just a bunch of opportunists. Of course, he was busy aura farming in the bath as well, even though they were Griot's minions just a little while ago. Now they were sucking up to Aster. While they were on the subject of sucking up to Aster, the blonde scoffed and said that he was not going to thank the boy for what he'd done. The brunette scoffed and pointed at Nolan, considering those were pretty big words for someone who had lost to Aster. The boy just scoffed that he did not lose, he just agreed to a draw. The others did not seem to mind though. They had defied the Elmimes, and they were saying it like it was going to be some kind of very simple matter, and now they were official candidates to be knights, of course. They were relaxed and excited. Eventually, all of these small victories would surely build into a massive wave that would crush that abusive family that dominated them at the top. Aster smiled that this was going to be the start of their rebellion. Spoken like a true comic protagonist, his two sisters had already graduated, but Alphen was still here since she had enrolled a year before. The boy guessed that she should be familiar with how things worked here and would surely be on his side. After the absolute ruckus that he had just caused by making the entire class get in, he might be in for a shock. At any rate, their training at the Night Academy would begin the next day, so the boy needed to get used to living here first. He walked away from the other boys in the bath, but then paused when he noticed that his new band of followers were just crawling after him. The dark-haired boy leapt back in horror, asking what they were doing, creeping around him like a pack of weirdos. However, his new tribe of worshippers explained that a living 7-winged holder was a good luck charm, and if they stuck with him, they might just be able to get some divine favor if they prayed to him. They were already turning Aster into a deity. The boy yelled at them that such a thing would never happen, and they needed to cut out their madness. Nolan just sighed as he watched the circus of clowns in front of him. The boy was already dreading the future. Later on, with the stars in the night sky twinkling high above the building, a pretty lady looked outside the window and sighed that Griot had heavily disappointed her. The poor boy was lying out in front of her, begging on his hands and knees, and the woman sighed. Far from dragging down that 7-winged child, he had also been completely won over by the enemy, and now he had the nerve to come crawling back to her. The lady turned with rage as she had heard that he had even heard Aster say that he was going to try to crush the Elmime family. This speaker was Helen Elmime, and she was furious. She asked if the boy had really just stood there and watched after suffering such an insult. Well, technically, he had not been standing when he heard his cousin say all that. He'd been lying defeated on the ground, but he was not about to tell her that. The poor boy wailed and cried to his mother in apology, saying that he would definitely make up for this blunder. He promised that next time he would meet her expectations, but the poor boy was kicked backwards with a heel on his foot. A different lady had come swooping in, and she called the boy trash, saying that there would not be a next time. Kicking him aside, she said that useless scum like griots would be better off ground into scrap meat and fed to the magic beast. It was Liliane Elmime, a rather rude-looking, haughty noble. She scoffed that the blonde was just like that absolute loser Darius, who had unfortunately died at an early age. The poor blonde shook, begging his family to spare him from Darius's sick and twisted end. They had fed his brother to a monster. To no one's surprise, this absolutely cruel and malicious being was his sister, and she happily kicked her brother in the stomach again, sending the poor boy flying. The boy cursed as he hit the ground, suffering and blaming Aster as he was kicked and punished by his own dysfunctional and terrible family. This was all because of him. That awful boy had dared to reach out a kind hand and ask his cousin to cooperate with. The boy had smiled, saying that it would be bad for him if he went back empty-handed like this. The blonde had stared at his cousin in hate, asking what on earth he was talking about. However, the black-haired boy knew that if word reached the great lord of the main family that his son was played by some branch family trash and failed the exam, well, griots would unfortunately but definitely die. The poor blonde was terrified, not because his cousin was threatening him but because his words were true. The main character had seen poor Darius' final moments after all, and it had been such a gruesome sight. The poor child. That was not the way any human should die, and Aster meant it. Likely, his other cousin griots did not want to end up like that either. If that was the case, then all he had to do was stay quiet and overlook what he was about to do. As long as griots did that, then Aster would help him out. That was the deal that they made. Currently, in the present, the daughter Lily was asked to spare her brother already before she actually killed him. Her cute little brother was crying and apologizing after all, so she should act with a bit more decorum instead of mirroring the monster that their father was. The young griots then groaned and looked up at his brother. One thing about the Elmheim family is that they really got busy. Now we're introduced to yet another son of Roderick, and this one was Julius A. Elmheim, who sat proudly on his high chair, chuckling that they were family bound by blood. Family needed to get along, that was what Julius believed, and as he said this, he patted the head of a girl who lay on his lap, smirking like a villain. He asked if Alphen agreed with him. The muzzled red-headed sister of the main character looked absolutely miserable and said nothing. The image of Elmheim's absolute dominance that had kept the knights in check until now was starting to waver with the appearance of a seven wings. That was why it was very important for the two functional siblings to remind them that this cruel family was not just for show. Now that the power of friendship had triumphed over evil, it was time for evil to move fast and remind the good and kind what real violence looked like. The training for the knights had begun, and they were working very hard, each of them focused on their swords. They had all been chosen specifically as cadets for the glorious Kingdom Knights. Since they had gone through all the trouble to get into the school, now they would have to work to keep their position. Kingdom Knights were elites who overwhelmed all other knights in every field from combat to strength to slaking off would never be considered an option. Naturally, those of them aspiring to this must also be exceptional and nothing less. The boys worked hard as they trained, slamming their swords against the target before them and sending sparks flying. Each of them practices their swordsmanship skills, cursing when they notice limitations in their strength. The instructor continued to say that their academy divided cadets into 6 grades and assigned a curriculum suited to their abilities. There was a grade from 1 to 6, in other words, the more capable the students were, the more opportunities they would have to learn to advance techniques. Swinging a sword was really just basic, level third-rate fighting. They needed to really learn how to wield one first. Grayos groaned as he struggled against the pillar in front of him, gritting his teeth as he continued to practice. Wielding magic power was the kind of thing that made the fighters second-rate, and Nolan quite calmly blasted that target before him with a nice slice of magic power. Only by mastering the bow, the sword, and magic could they finally become first-rate fighters. They had nothing to teach mediocrities below third-rate, and that was why anyone who wanted to learn first-rate techniques should first get stronger. They had to keep continuously proving their strength as the only freedom permitted to them. The charge from that speech encouraged the boys to keep fighting as they valiantly trained and worked to level up their power. Red light flashed around them as they fought and trained hardcore, just for the attacking red magic to get washed away almost instantly. The other students raised their heads in shock, but of course, this was just something that Casual did from time to time. He would show up, steal the show, save some people, and then shrug off like it was nothing. The students adored him. The students continued to work hard, and the instructor who had been against them before was actually quite impressed now. He said that they should then aim for this level first. The other students were not having it. There was no way all of them could summon a strong gust of magical wind that would just flatline their opponent. They were not superstars after all. Meanwhile, Aster noticed people ogling him again, which was exhausting for him. They had heard of the 7 wings, and they admired his incredible talent. That was great for politics, because they were quite intimidated by how he had so easily handled a magical iron pillar of the same quality as a golem. Without a doubt, the boy was definitely to be classified as someone special and in line to become one of the greats in a way. However, the hidden potential of the 7 wings was far more than just an ability. If he were to be satisfied with his current self, he would end up being devoured by those who hungered after his power. They knew of a specific dragon nesting in the academy that, of course, also happened to be his oldest cousin from the wrong side of the family. Later, the dark-haired boy walked with a few teachers, and they discussed his grades. Here was a lot to consider, and they were a bit amazed that they were still being played with and tested after finally passing the exam. Well, that much should be expected considering so many of them had gotten in at one time, and the school had never admitted this many Knight students before. It seemed an equal exchange. These Kingdom Knights were completely meritocratic. Among their peers, the only ones who did not start in 6th grade were Aster and Nolan. The young dark-haired boy looked at his card, which was a 4, while his brunette friend was a 6th grade warrior. The brunette sighed that they were already getting left behind. They had expected that much, and getting left behind was at least better than getting kicked out or dying unfortunate deaths. At any rate, they said that they could not become a Kingdom Knight unless they reached 2nd grade or higher. The dark-haired main character chuckled that he would be in real trouble if his team did not catch up, so he would be rooting for them to boost their level and fight at his side. The brunette sighed that their boss was pretty strict. The main character was kind of shocked to suddenly have a fancy new title. The brunette pointed and said that it was too late for Aster to back out now. He was the one who said that they would work together to bring down Elmheim, so it was much too late for him to back out of being their boss. There were quite a few guys who took those words seriously after all, and they were really looking forward to it. The way they spoke, it was clear that they believed that perhaps the 7-winged child would bring about a change in their current situation, and it was something that they wanted to believe in. So, they offered to back him up. Happily, the brunette put his arm around his new boss's neck and cheered the destruction of the Elmheim family. The main character smirked, saying that if that was the case, then they all needed to get stronger even more so. In truth, the boy had not at all forgotten his goal, considering how revenge flooded through his very veins. For that very reason, he himself needed to get stronger. He was not yet at the level to confront his former father, but before they could even overcome that, they first needed to eat. With an empty stomach like this, they would not make it through the afternoon training. However, they were surprised to see a crowd of people standing outside the door. When the main character and his brunette sidekick came forward to check it out, they soon found out why everyone was hesitant to enter. The other students were really pleased to see Aster, because they were really scared of whatever it was that was sitting at the other side of that door. Before they could relay what they had discovered, someone from the other side of the room greeted Aster. The boy had been taking so long that they had sat there eating first. Now the main character came forward, and he saw his cousins and their evil aura dominating the mess hall. They grinned with a wicked smirk and called him brother. Everyone was terrified, realizing that if that blonde was speaking in a familiar tone to their boss, then they had just run into another son of the Elmime family. But this guy was even scarier than Grios. Aster sighed internally as he recognized the second in line to succession, the second son of the Mayan house, Julius A. Elmime, and his younger sister Liliane. They were the tyrant siblings known for being the most vicious in the house of Elmime. He had almost forgotten that those two would be here at this point in the story. The sister smirked when she saw her little cousin, grinning that he had a much cuter face than she expected. He was completely different from their trash younger brother, whom they had laid out on the floor, and they were now using him as a footstool. The good news is that Grios was still alive at least. The others who watched were horrified, wondering what kind of mask they had forced their brother to wear. However, Aster easily recognized the iron shackle. It was a disciplinary device used by the House of Elmheim to correct Droplet. He recognized it well from his past life. Though his elder cousin did not know that, of course, he was surprised that the main character knew it at all. Even though Grios carried the Elmheim name, Julius was pretty disappointed that his brother had ended up in 6th grade in today's sorting. It was rather pathetic for an Elmheim. Then the boy put his hand to the mask and said that to help him further, he was going to give the kid a special present from his elder brother to help him try harder. If you made food, water and fresh air into a reward, anyone would start trying as if their life depended on it. That was the Elmheim belief, of course. Due to the nature of the masks, it was not easy for the wearer to take them off, and they would likely die with them on. Now the other students stared in horror to see an army of other masked individuals march into the room. They picked up, of course, wondering what was going on. All the soldiers had sharp eyes like starving beasts, and they were the seniors, so the students should greet them properly. Then, he turned and greeted a redhead, who had been standing silently in the corner all this time. It had been a while since she had reunited with her brother, so they were probably eager to meet again. The main character stared in horror when he saw the redhead step out of the shadows. It was his dear sister, but she had changed quite a bit now. After all, she had that mask glued to her face. Aster screamed out in rage when he saw what they had done to his dear sister Alphen, and she refused to meet his gaze. This made the main character grit his teeth, fury rising in him in waves. With rage, he drew his sword, cursing at Julius as he asked what he had done to his sister. However, one of the iron masks fell to the floor. With a smug look on his face, the blonde laughed, telling Aster not to worry too much about it. He had plenty of masks with him, and he had prepared enough for all of the other students gathered in the room. The blonde grinned and spread his hands, inviting the terrified and horrified students to a fun welcome party. The wicked oldest Elmheim son laughed at the panicked look on the boys' faces, telling them to put some spirit into their recruiting. Their opponents were the juniors of the Iron Reed after all, so if they wanted to eat a decent meal tonight, all the seniors had to do was catch one junior each, slap a mask on them one by one and drag them here. The masked soldiers rushed forward, and the fighters groaned as they raised their weapons to battle against their trained seniors. Given the fact that they were just recently recruited, it was not making for a very good matchup. Their eyes were completely glazed over, and they were pretty capable. Nolan stood his ground as he battled against those mindless zombies, saying that at the very least, they were all 4th grade or higher level warriors. The brunette had figured out that they would end up fighting House Elmheim eventually, but this was way too soon, and they had barely formed their alliance. It was pretty smart of the evil house to attack now before they could get any stronger. To attack the resistance in a place like this made the other students really come to terms with the vast difference in fighting power. Concerned, the brunette called their boss and asked what they should do. Aster was kind of currently occupied with crashing out over the state of his sister. At this rate, they were going to end up joining that masked group if they did not fight back in some kind of significant way. Well, the boy pulled out his sword, its blade glowing red, and he took down the two seniors in front of him. Even if he was upset, the boy could still harness his power. The brunette was amazed by the intensity just rolling off the main boy in waves. Their boss really and truly was hardcore in every possible way. Julius, his cousin, had really crossed the line by pulling this move. The main character's voice got deeper as he questioned what exactly the blonde meant to accomplish by doing this. His older cousin laughed, saying that there was no reason for them to be so on the edge. This was just his own way of showing some goodwill. Goodwill that somehow translated to taking over a bunch of underlings without any real skill. According to Julius, Those guys had only passed the exam by picking up Aster's scraps, and they were not worthy to be called knights. Insects like them that swarmed around and called themselves cadets were unacceptable. Julius could never accept such low-quality fighters. When the level at the bottom was this low, he was sure that those at the top would get mocked. So, he was doing Aster a favor by getting rid of the trash. As long as he was the one at the top, then he could not let half-assed things like that slide, which was why he was currently using his own brother as some kind of footstool. This was why Julius was grinning as he said that he would just take care of all of the garbage at once, in the Elmheim way, of course. That was not what Aster was asking at all, and he walked all the way to his cousin with rage burning in his eyes. The boy said that he was telling his stupid cousin to hurry up and take that vulgar thing off his sister's mouth, or he would be trying to kill him. That was all the warning that Julius got before Aster swung. His sword came down, but he was horrified to see Alphen get in his way instead of his cousin or any of his actual enemies. The boy could not believe it. The girl glared at him, and Julius laughed as the boy fought against his sister, their swords clashing as they exchanged blows. The main character was told not to hold such a jealous grudge now, especially when his sister had joined his cousin of her own free will. In fact, he could ask her directly, and Julius did just that. He asked her to confirm if this situation was her choice. The little devil beside the blonde laughed that her brother was so mean. Meanwhile, Aster was angry and in despair. His mother had been worried since they had not heard from their sister in a while, and he was even angrier to find out why. The dark-haired boy admitted that he did not know what was going on here. However, he called out to his sister, telling her that she did not have to listen to people like this. He offered to save her, but she just parried and swung her sword, pushing him even further back. The poor main character could not understand why she was resisting him so much. It was very likely that she had been threatened in some way or form and was too scared to take his hand. Suddenly, Nolan yelled at Aster, asking him why he was wasting so much time. If he was not going to strike down their main enemy, then Nolan would take over. The senior Elmheim had even less class than his younger brother, and it made him sick to his stomach to think a man like that could call himself a knight. Nolan demanded that Julius take up his sword so that they could have a fair duel. Naturally, the Elmheims did not really believe too much in fairness or honesty. They were really not big fans of that at all. So, Nolan went soaring forward with his sword pointed at Julius' face, while swearing that he would carve the style of House Nolan into the man's very body. However, a mask flew into the air. Julius sighed, asking if working harder at studying the sword than others made a great knight. Nolan was shocked to see that his enemy had grabbed his sword. He had not even deflected with a weapon, but with his own hand. Then the big blonde stood, informing the sword prodigy that he was wrong. He raised his fairy fist, and Nolan found himself overwhelmed by the onslaught of heat just coming from that man. He tried to pull back, but it was too late because Julius was not letting go of his sword. Instead, the pompous Elmheim smirked and said that the strongest guy would always be the greatest, whether it was through sword, magic, hook, or crook. With that, he kicked Nolan across the room, using his intense magical power to propel the poor boy. The brunette raced to help Nolan, who had gotten a significant part of his body burned by that magic power. No matter how one looked at it, our boy did not have enough powerhouses on his team to hold a revolution. He was the one carrying everyone's weight. The brunette groaned when he saw Nolan's terrible burn, but he still helped him stand up. Suddenly, a voice said that she happened to like guys who put on noble airs, and it just made her want to trample all over their pride and dignity. Unfortunately, the little Elmheim sister was on the move, and she seemed to be targeting the brunette and Nolan with a mask in her hand. She smirked and said that she would make an exception and keep Nolan as a pet because he was so entertaining, but she did not need the brunette who was clinging to him. Her older brother dared to laugh that being weak was definitely a sin. Being able to say whatever you wanted was a privilege reserved for the strong alone. Their cousin had been throwing his power around to gather allies, but now his allies were falling over with masks forced to their faces. His revolution was going to be over before it even began. They would crush it in the name of Elmheim, and in the end, he would just get swallowed up by someone stronger. That was the way of the world. Now Julius was laughing at them, asking the crumbling people before him where their tomorrow would lie now. Well, now Aster was beyond enraged to see his plans go up in smoke this fast. He raced forward with his eyes light red as he allowed himself to get rage baited by his cousin. The blonde grinned as that red sword got closer to him. Aster was in for yet another surprise. The evil Julius had formed a magical barrier around his weak points using aura alone, which meant that our dude's sword could not even graze his cousin's neck. This looked like total defeat because Julius could definitely put his hand on Aster, and he did. He grabbed that boy by the neck, and then he set him on fire. The brunette could not believe that he could actually hear his boss screaming in pain when he was their last hope for salvation in this situation. The older blonde sighed when he saw how easy it was to take his cousin down. He had expected more, considering the power of the 7 wings and all. This was such a disappointment, and the blonde chuckled that he had thought that his cousin would be way more useful. However, Aster had a little surprise for his cousin. Just because he had deflected his attack a single time was no reason for Julius to get so damn full of himself. Saying this, Aster unleashed a tornado of magical power around them. The blonde was familiar with this rotation, as this was the same movement that had killed the beast that used to live in their basement. The blonde then realized that his opponent had reeled in his magic power in that rolling vortex. Within seconds, Julius got blasted, the full force of that magical energy targeting him and only him. It was not very good luck for the older Elmheim. Now that the dark-haired boy had recovered, he scoffed that his cousin was blabbering on about something really stupid, but he did not feel like listening. He had been training this entire time to kill a force that was much bigger than Julius. If they thought his revolution would stop at this point, they were way in over their heads. Julius was collapsed on a broken table, but Aster was a cool guy. He was going to give his cousin a chance to stand up, and he could also try repeating his words a second time. Now that he thought about it, his cousin had been saying something about how Small Fry should stay quiet. Ironic considering his pathetic position now, and Julius got heated. The brunette stared in shock at the feat that Aster just pulled off. Even the Elmheim sister was shocked to see her brother get knocked down like that. They had not expected the child that they mocked from being an adopted fatherless trash to actually take down the pretty blonde from the fancy high family. The black-haired boy then glared at the man whom he hated. The eldest Elmheim brother pushed to his feet, groaning that getting smacked like that definitely hurt a lot more than he had expected to. That boy had really gone ahead and sent him flying. The blonde chuckled, wondering what on earth he would have done if the boy had scratched up his precious crest, which was apparently located on his chest. The others were horrified and shocked to see how completely fine their enemy was. No one was really happy to see that, since this dude was causing them a lot of pain. The sister was thrilled, of course, to see her demon spawn brother stand up again. She giggled and pointed at him, saying that he was so lame talking all big just to get countered like that. The boy just laughed like this was a simple matter, telling his sister not to be so blunt. Even a guy like him had feelings after all. Like that, he grabbed his sword off the floor and roared that his cousin sure had a lot of nerve calling him trash. It turned out the peaceful and calm demeanor was all a scam because he was raging about the situation. The man growled that his cousin sure was getting really cocky just because he was playing along with his stupid little game of house. But it was time for all of the fun and games to end. He hoped the boy was ready to die. The boy just scoffed and told his big cousin to stop with his fancy, long-winded threats like they were characters from a Saturday cartoon. If his cousin was going to knock him down, then he should come already and try it. Both their power soared high in the room, 7 wings against the blonde as heated flames, 2 men of pride in different paths, facing off against each other in the school. Of course, teachers were nowhere to be found because no one wanted to be caught between a fight among the Elmheim kids. The blonde growled in annoyance, swinging his sword, and Aster swung right back. That was when someone suddenly showed up and told the two that they had done quite enough. It seemed that there was someone who was actually still willing to interfere in this kind of dumpster fire, and the two clashing students had to slow down because they recognized that voice. It was none other than Earl Mays who had suddenly pulled up. The familiar giggly foxy man chuckled, asking what these kids thought a cafeteria existed for. It definitely was not an area designed for 2 pompous nobles to start throwing hands. They were supposed to be eating here. It was a real headache when the boy went up to rampaging like this when they should be resting. In fact, he could not believe the mess that they had made of the place. As a director, he could not exactly just sit back and watch them trash the whole area either. The blonde is not interested in backing down. He told Mays to just stay out of this and that a mere lackey of the 6th head had no business interfering here. Well, that was an interesting statement, and the brunette laughed, telling the blonde not to be so harsh, especially for someone who was a first grade and a candidate for the top seat. No less, to get worked up fighting an inferior like this was unbecoming for the heir. It was definitely not a very good look. Slowly, the man stepped between the two boys, telling them that it would be for the best to put away their swords. Very carefully, the boy raised his hand and pressed a gentle touch over the steel sword. The blonde scoffed, muttering that his cousin had no idea how much trouble he had caused him. Technically, that idiot had generated the trouble himself, so he barely had any room to complain. Since that was the case, the boy lowered his sword and agreed that he would let this one slide, just this once. Hefting his giant sword over his shoulders, he told the boys to pack it up and that the welcome party was over. Aster was horrified and protested, knowing that they could not end here. He had not even retrieved his sister or taken care of the stupid mass situation either. He yelled for them to stop, but the Earl just placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. He appreciated how hot-headed the kid could be, but he would appreciate it more if they could give the Earl some face here. The boy was livid. He had to just stand and watch his sister walk away with that awful group. He called out to her, unable to understand why she was working with those awful people. With an unrelenting expression, because of the mask, she just glanced back at him, before turning and walking away. The poor boy was speechless, but he looked down at some of the masks discarded on the ground and thought worriedly of his dear sister Alphen. Later on, The group cursed as they met up and considered the situation. That Julius guy was a total monster. Poor Nolan had been taken out and was currently in the hospital getting treated for those intense injuries, and a bunch of their coworkers had gotten captured with masks over their faces. They could not believe that the teachers had done nothing to free those guys. Instead, they had been dragged away wearing those weird masks. The brunette asked what the next move was from their young boss. The boy then turned to Earl Mays, blaming him for not stopping those guys. His assistant was not having it, telling the boy to be a bit more respectful when he addressed the Honorable Earl Mays, who had worked so hard to mediate for him. The man just laughed and said that it was fine. After all, he and that little kid happened to go way back. He had witnessed when they tossed that little boy into a little death game, and he had crawled out of it alive after all. The boy glared, but the Earl was still smiling in that way of his, like he controlled or knew everything. 4 years ago, when the boy had been summoned to the main house, this blue-haired Earl had been the only one among the Elmheim-affiliated knight nobility who had taken his side. He had been saved by him back then, but honestly, the main character still could not tell if this laughing blue clown was a friend or a foe. He had no idea what he was thinking, and he still could not read him. Still, the boy pointed out that this dude was some kind of director. Since that was the case, then he should be able to do something about the havoc that those two were wreaking at the school, even if they held the title of Elmheim. Surely, they could not just let that kind of tyranny slide. The man laughed and decided to clarify to these two kids that he also happened to be the executive of the House of Elmheim, so it was kind of within his duty to support those two rascals even if they were just spawns of the devil. Unless it was a major issue, he could not go around questioning anything that the family heads did after all. The boy was still livid though. There was no way that it was legal to force masks on lying people like they were no more than animals. He expected this to be the kind of major issue that people in power would take seriously. However, something like that was not exactly bothering the people in power, which was where the definition of major issue tended to kick in. This school had always been a meritocratic training ground for knights after all. Regardless of the methods, if they led to the growth of the candidates, then the man had no reason to oppose them. In fact, the candidates under Julius unfortunately saw their grades rise remarkably fast thanks to his sadistic method. Even the principal had to condone his methods. This means that they could not count on anyone to stop this for them. Well, Astor already figured that it was a long shot anyway. The Earl watched the boy curiously and asked if he was thinking of doing something stupid, like going straight into enemy territory, just to get them back. The Earl would not recommend it as he could not save the boy twice. Every move that the dark-haired boy made was going to be monitored by the main family, and since entering the academy, he had already done quite a lot. One wrong step and they could have the boy expelled whenever they wanted. The boy growled that this was no excuse to abandon the people who believed in him, or the people that he wanted to save. This was not about some sense of justice or anything fake. It was just that this iron shackle was the kind of thing that was sure to rot the human soul, and he could not stand for its existence. It was the kind of thing to strip away a person's freedom, and it stripped away their words as well as their dignity and identity. It was the kind of machination that would eventually start to strip away their will to rebel against their master. It was an item designed to break new recruits like they were no more than sheep for the slaughter, each waiting their turn to join the chopping block, turning people into obedient and convenient tools. That was the true horror of the iron shackle. The Earl was curious, considering that Astor was speaking like he had seen it happen before. The boy just chuckled that he happened to know the fate of those for whom it was already too late. He did not want to watch his friends end up like that. It was much too cruel. The Earl pondered what the boy meant, but the main character just chuckled and told the Earl not to worry. Right now, Astor was not exactly keen on getting expelled either. If they could settle this peacefully, then that would be all the better for him as well. The boy reached for the door, and the blue-haired man watched him curiously, asking the boy if he had some kind of plan. The Earl should probably know it by now. Astor's way of fighting was very different from normal techniques after all. 3 days later, the knights were busy training and kicking up a storm as they ran for dear life during their training. The tired brunette groaned as he called out to Nolan, asking the other boy if he was truly okay to be up and walking. He had endured a serious and brutal hit in their last fight after all. However, that hit was exactly why the determined boy was not about to slow down and give up. He had no time to rest because the grade 4 curriculum would begin soon. Besides, the boy insisted that the hit was nothing more than a scratch. That was rich coming from someone who still had a bandage on his face. Well, the brunette was getting used to his stubbornness by now. Either way, there was one person they should be worried about right now, and it was the dude running ahead of them like he was being chased by a pack of wild dogs. Astor had been on the edge for a while, running around and training with a mask on his face. Others had to wonder what had gotten into him all of a sudden. Apparently, the boy had rocked right up to his cousin a second time. And the boastful blonde had been the same as usual. He thought that his cousin sure had some nerve to show his face in front of him a second time. He still had not forgiven him for the last time, not even close. Now, Astor dared to barge in out of nowhere and say that he wanted to make a deal. The blonde asked who the heck he thought he was, making demands in a place like this. The casual rich and spoilt brat was, of course, chugging down a bottle of expensive liquor as he berated his cousin. The blonde smirked and then said that he meant exactly what he said. Well, Aster just said again that he had come to take his sister and his classmates, whom the boy had locked up. In exchange for that, he would let Julius put an iron shackle on him. That was his condition. His sister was absolutely horrified to hear this news, wondering what on earth her sibling was thinking. But she was a huge reason that he was doing all this. The black-haired boy was sure that word had already reached the blonde that the boy was under suspicion of treason. In that case, slapping a collar on the rebel was not a bad deal after all. It would help to maintain the superiority complex of the Elmheim family after all, and all it would cost them was a fee, useless slaves. Julius's sister laughed. In her opinion, only someone mad would volunteer to be another person's pet. She even concluded that the boy had to be some kind of masochist. The blonde boy scoffed, hating the situation, but he would admit that this dark-haired menace was a thorn in Elmheim's side. It was annoying that the boy was born with 7 wings, and even more annoying that he could wield his power to some degree. Mother and the board would be thrilled for him to walk around campus wearing a collar like an own beast. However, the blonde scoffed and said that Aster did not at all strike him as the type to play nice and obey, so he had no reason to believe that the dark-haired boy would stay true to the deal. The blonde demanded to know what the angle was here. The angle was, as our dude said, he would wear the collar as long as his friends were free. The blonde could not believe it, so his cousin decided to break it down for him. It was a mask that was locked with magic, and only they had the key. They could kill him any time they liked, but even so, they hesitated. Finally, Aster smiled. It seemed that being honest was not going to get him anything from this lot, so he went ahead to dig his heels into their back. It seemed that they were not fond of the fact that they could break him after all. Not that he could blame them for having that sentiment, he was not an easy mule to control after all. However, he had surely assumed that the future heirs to the Elmheim name would have more confidence in their own abilities. Basically, all he had to do was goad them, and his cousin was all fired up. Or got so heated he started melting the wine bottle in his hand. Since that was how the main character was going to play it, the blonde villain decided to bite. However, after all that talk, just swapping people outright would be way too soft. The blonde considered 7 days, then he growled and said 10. 10 days wearing that thing with no food or water. If Aster was still breathing after that, then his older cousin promised to let them all go. The redhead girl was horrified, begging and shaking her head to dispel her little brother from making such a foolish choice. She begged that it was impossible and no normal human would survive such inhumane treatment. If he agreed to such a deal, he would surely die. That was cute, but the boy had suffered way worse hell than what he was currently being subjected. He'd had to live with the main Elmheim family after all. The poison they could stretch out to him would never compare to what he had endured in their embrace. Knowing this, our dude took that deal with a bend to his knees. Iron shackles had a way of rotting people from the inside. He knew that all too well, considering he had been raised in Elmheim as nothing but a tool. His sister Alphen was suffering. He usually knew her to be quite fairy, stubborn, and easily hurt like anyone else. Yet she never let anyone see that softness. She was his strong big sister, and he wanted to preserve that image of her forever. However, now she could not even stand up to scum like this. Watching her like that really made his blood boil. She looked at him with a weakness and powerlessness that he did not like to see in her eyes. That was why he promised in his heart to help her break those chains. Then they could sit down and really talk again, just like the old times. Saying this with a tired smile, he accepted as the grinning pink-haired cousin put that shackle around him. Many of the other shackled knights were falling apart during training. They felt exhausted, and the instructor called out to them, telling them to stand up and that no one told them that they could rest. They panted and huffed, struggling just to breathe, and Grios cursed his life and his fate. He had no idea why he had to go through this degenerate way of living. Even the ones in masks did not get special treatment from the drill sergeant, and the brunette groaned at the situation. At this rate, they would probably die before Aster got the chance to save them. However, Nolan felt there was one guy that he would call Karma, and he was looking right at poor Grios, who had spent a lot of his life bullying people, and now he had to endure the exact same maltreatment from his own family. It was a lot for the boy to bear. Still, the brunette could not believe it. It had been a few days now, but their boss had not even slowed down once. He was running ahead of most of the group, even with that mask on, looking completely fine. The brunette wondered if 7 wings were freaks when it came to stamina, too. Aster had a little trick that he had learned to survive brutal environments even without the help of magic. A person could only go without a foot of water for 3 or maybe 4 days, a week at the absolute limit, and that was if they were sitting still like a cocoon. With training piled on day after day like this, the boy should already be at his limit already, and yet he was still going. Then Nolan asked if they had heard of that rumor before the seen-winged child was found. The rumor that the infant was found supposedly crawling alone over a snow-covered mountain. A tiny baby had taken its small hands and dragged itself for kilometers through the drifts. If that was true, then the snow-haired boy would admit that it was definitely an impressive will to live. Personally, the stiff noble had a feeling that the story was more than just a tall tale after all. Meanwhile, back inside, most of the knights were struggling to recover from the grueling training. The pink-haired sister had come in, happily laughing to the sewer rats before her that it was feeding time. With a wave of her finger, the masks fell off those who were locked in the dungeon, and they were each given a single slice of cheese and water. This was all that they were allowed to eat every day, and the boys in the dungeon sobbed that they were at this limit by now. Every day, they were treated like slaves, and some feared that if this kept going, it was going to kill them. Gryos then turned to his sister, begging for any form of favoritism that she could spare. He was really hungry and would greatly appreciate something decent to eat. Well, the girl responded by crushing the cheese offered into smithereens. The boy stared in defeat at the cheese underneath her foot, and she laughed manically like a curse sent from the underworld. As far as she was concerned, if they hated their food so much, then they could go ahead without it. She was being so gracious to let them have food, and she pouted that they were really not wasting food after all. Unlike them, someone was suffering way more than they were. The person in question was, of course, our main character, whose mask had not fallen off because he was not allowed food or water. He sat still with his hands hanging limply, conserving his energy for the days ahead. The girl giggled and turned to Alfin, saying that her little brother was pretty admirable after all. In fact, the wicked blonde suggested that she should go over there and even cheer him up a bit. The girl looked absolutely miserable, which made the blonde tease her more, guessing that she struggled to even look him in the eye, considering their current situation. Knowing that he had ended up like that, because of her surely hurt something in her conscience. Well, the guilt was very clearly bothering her, because she looked pretty tortured just listening to the blonde dude talk. The poor girl had no idea what she was supposed to do in this situation, as she very clearly wanted to help, but she had no idea what she could even do. The girl had a proper spread of food before her since she was a noble and her mask was unlocked, but she was still feeling so bitter watching her little brother slowly starve to death. Likely, they even gave her more food just to rub the guilt deep into her soul. However, the blonde sadist had his own problems to consider as he angrily bit into the meat that he had been served. He was indeed having a lot of fun torturing Aster, but he had also assumed that weak, pampered boy had some trick ready to get out of this mess. Still, the black-haired demon that was tormenting the Elmheim family showed no sign of resisting at all. He wore the mask, he obediently carried out his tasks with it on, and did not break away despite the discomfort. It was maddening and confusing to the selfish blonde. Now he started to wonder if this mad boy really had every full intention of enduring the full 10 days without food or water. If that was the case, that worked well for Julius, too. The 7 wings were a thorn in their side anyway, and they were perfectly fine with doing away with his power if he died. They would see just how long his foolish pride was going to last, and the blonde was going to enjoy every second of watching Aster surely crumble and fail. Aster as well looked up from where he sat, his golden eyes burning with determination as he fought to see this crazy deal through to the bitter end. It was a battle of will, and only one winner would come out victorious. The question was which Elmheim would walk away the champion of this silent fight. That's it for this episode. Until next time.